Mais voyons donc, c'est qui ça, l'antipode?
Je pense que pour asseoir, on va passer à Dr Fatima. Moi, en tout cas, je m'en ennuie. Ça fait longtemps qu'on l'a pas écouté.
C'était quoi le terme? Put?
Oui,
What?
c'était put.
Ben là, quoi?
Ouais. Ça avait l'air que le mot put en anglais, il est assez proche du mot avec un E en français que.
Je comprends pas. C'est correct.
Eh ben,
C'est mieux trop que pas assez.
c'est mieux trop que
Good
pas assez.
job. Good
Ben,
job à l'automodération.
ben écoute, au
C'est
moins
un
on est
terme
là de
commun,
même.
put, là.
Ouais. Ben oui.
I'm gonna put the thing on the thing, genre. En tout cas.
Ouais. Ah ouais, non, c'est. Écoute,
Ah,
au moins c'est nous autres qui a le contrôle, c'est pas un AI, c'est déjà ça. C'est au moins ça. Au moins, écoute, il faut assumer nos décisions de modération sur Twitch. On
ouais,
peut
mais
pas
écoute,
dire ah, c'est objectif, c'est l'algorithme. C'est scientifique, c'est plus scientifique, c'est l'AI qui a décidé.
on n'a pas le droit. On n'a pas le droit de parler de CO2. Jeff Bezos n'aime pas ça quand on parle de CO2.
Bon. Qu'est-ce qu'il va faire, là? Il va nous censurer, le gros méchant.
Bon, à date, il fait pas grand-chose.
Ouais. Non, pas vraiment. Il y a deux vidéos à soir de Dr Fatima. Un premier d'une quarantaine de minutes, comme vous pouvez voir, puis l'autre d'à peu près 1 heure. Celui-là, dans le fond, ce qu'on voit, c'est les limites du peer-reviewed, puis d'utiliser en particulier les citations pour évaluer la qualité d'un travail scientifique. Fait que quand on parlait de limite de la science tantôt, on en voit un autre ici. Fait qu'on commence ça. C'est particulièrement intéressant. Je pense même que c'est dans celui-là qu'elle mentionne l'exemple de quelqu'un qui s'attendait à trop de la science, dans le sens qu'il s'attendait à ce que ça réponde à pas nécessairement ses angoisses existentielles, mais sur la nature du monde, un peu comme la religion, puis qu'il a été déçu, puis qu'il s'est dit ah, la science, c'est de la merde parce que ça répond pas à ça. Ouais, mais c'est comme si tu me disais c'est de la merde un marteau, on peut pas mesurer la distance. Mais oui, mais c'est pas ça que ça sert un marteau.
Don't you love it when people tell on themselves? You know, that thing where somebody's confidently asserting something and they think they're owning someone else, but the rest of us can see how they actually don't know what they're talking about. A
Ben
self-own,
Shapiro.
if you will. So about a year ago, this famous astronomer published a paper on hiring practices that sparked a Twitter controversy complete with Maoist apologies and cancel culture claims. From a distance, this might have looked to some people like yet another case of online activists silencing the scientists who are just trying to ask questions. But that's not what happened. Here's what happened. This guy wrote a paper that didn't just tell on himself, it told on every other scientist that has deluded themselves into thinking that research is meritocratic. So buckle up and call your librarian friend. We're talking bibliometrics and twitter.com.
أنا اللي اخترت أحبك ودي أول خطوة صح وجودك جنب مني وجودي جنب مني أنا صح وألف صح.
She's serving a whole academic moment. The books, the turtleneck, the glasses. JK, these glasses are just as fake as my microphone. So first, we're going to break down this paper, but before I get into that, I just want to say up front that I'm not interested in, uncritical dunking on takes I vaguely disagree with. I am not here to drag the author of this paper, truly. I will absolutely be dragging his paper, with evidence to back up my claims, of course, but I'm not interested in him so much as what his ideas tell us about the field. I don't think he's a bad guy trying to do bad things. I just think he's articulated a very common line of thinking that could use some examination. So with that out of the way, John Cormandy is a guy who's considered a big deal in astronomy because the field has convinced itself that this is a line, actually. And yes, I am calling out galactic astronomers. Your relations are tenuous at best. But for real, let's talk about Cormandy's science for a second, because it will turn out to be kind of enlightening in the context of his arguments about meritocracy that this video is actually about. This will be the only technical stuff we get into today, and it'll just be a minute. Trust me, the payoff is going to be... So Cormandy studies galaxies, which are big groups of stars like the Milky Way, which is the galaxy we live in. The Milky Way is an example of a spiral galaxy, which has all these pretty twisty arms, but most galaxies actually fall into another category called elliptical galaxies, which basically just look like big blobs. The graph that I was making fun of earlier is called the Cormandy relation, courtesy of our friend over here, which shows an observed relationship between the size of an elliptical galaxy and how bright it is. A bigger galaxy is more diffuse, so more of it's faint, and a smaller galaxy is more concentrated, so more of it is bright. Here's the problem though. It turns out this relation isn't actually saying much because one of these quantities is basically caused by the other one. Super simplified, the brightness of a galaxy is caused by two things: the power it's outputting via all the stars in it burning, and the size. Increasing the power means it gets brighter, but increasing the size makes it less bright because it's less concentrated. So with a bunch of galaxies of the same power output, there automatically has to be a relation between the size and the brightness. If the difference between power and brightness here is a little confusing, just think about a light bulb. The same 60-watt light bulb will appear brighter if it's close by or used to illuminate something small than if it's far away or used to illuminate something big, even though the power hasn't changed. It's still 60 watts. So the Cormandi relation would have been interesting if it held for galaxies of different power outputs, but researchers later found out that it does not. It only holds if you're comparing galaxies of similar power outputs, which means it's not really telling us anything that you couldn't demonstrate with a lamp and some boxes of various sizes. This is the part I really want you to remember for later. What Cormandi did in his groundbreaking thesis was plot one thing against an indirect measure of the same thing and say, look, they match.
Est-ce que tout le monde comprend ce qu'il est en train d'expliquer là, par rapport à la taille et la luminosité? Comment est-ce qu'il fait juste mesurer l'effet de deux variables sur elles-mêmes en circle?
Ah, c'est circulaire.
Ouais.
I found a new physical correlation. So Cormandi published this result in his thesis back in 1977, and if you look him up on Wikipedia today, you will find exactly two pieces of information about him. That he's known for the relation we just explained, and that since then, he's won lots of awards. Nothing about how the Cormandi relation has fallen out of use because it's basically just a statement of bias, but whatever. He's a very serious scientist with very serious credentials. Fast forward to 2021, when Cormandi one day decides to completely depart from his lane and publish a paper titled Metrics of Research Impact in Astronomy, predicting later impact from metrics measured 10 to 15 years after the PhD, in which he's collected some data and written some code that he claims can predict how successful a given researcher will be in the future. He presents this data and this code with the explicit aim of people using it to inform decisions on research allocations such as job hires and tenure decisions. In other words, a guy that astronomy students will read about in their textbooks said, "Hey everybody, here's an algorithm that we should use to decide who gets jobs." This already sounds super fun, right? Let's get into it. So the first thing we need to understand is citations. We all know what a citation is, right? When someone refers to somebody else's work so they can build on top of it instead of starting from scratch. It looks like this, and you might recognize them from the corner of my videos because unlike some people, I'm not a hack. Citations are useful for lots of reasons, the obvious one being attributing work and ideas to their original creators. But there's one use of citations that's increasingly controversial: quantifying scientific impact, a practice that falls under the broader category of bibliometrics. The basic idea here is that impactful things, be they journals, articles, or people, will be cited more often than less impactful things. So by studying the
J'ai même vu un livre qui m'a été proposé récemment par Routledge qui parlait, c'était le livre sur les algorithmes de diffusion du savoir scientifique. L'impact. À quel point c'est lu.
The citations, we can understand whose work is the most valuable. If a work really pushes the field forward, lots of people want to talk about it, and therefore there will be lots of citations. This is one of the key premises of the paper, that the more citations somebody has, the more valuable their work is, and therefore the more money we should give to them. Which seems reasonable if you're operating on 2 brain cells. This is important, but
Fait que là, parce que si tu lui donnes plus d'argent, il va produire plus de travail, donc il va être cité plus souvent. Fait que là, tu vas lui donner plus d'argent. Puis là...
I want to get through it quickly, so we're just going to do a little rapid-fire debunking of why citation count does not equal value created. Number 1, the Matthew effect. Beginning with advantage accumulates advantage. This can be caused by people, like when a researcher cites a paper that lots of other people have cited because other people have cited it. But this can also be caused by algorithms, like when Google Scholar shows papers with high citation counts first, meaning that they get more views and are more likely to be cited again. It's basically the rich get richer of academic publishing. Number 2, bias towards certain types of research. Interdisciplinary research, novel research tend to get cited less often than their single-disciplinary, non-novel counterparts. There are reasons for this, but TLDR, none of them are good. Number 3, bias towards arbitrary features. There are statistically significant trends in citation counts based on absolute nonsense, like title length, or the choices of punctuation used in a title. Some very sad people use this information as career advice. More on that later, unfortunately. Number 4, reasons for citing something. The idea that citation count equals support assumes that the only reason
Hey,
you would
attends une
cite
minute, je veux
something is
voir
because
qu'est-ce
you
qu'elle a
agree
cité
with
deux
it.
secondes.
You can see very sad people see significant trends in citation counts based on absolute nonsense, like
Par rapport au
title length or the choices of punctuation used in a title. Some very
Study 5 way to increase citation count. What's your title length?
sad people use
Avoid mentioning country in your title, abstract or keyword. Cut the hyphens, ok. Les hyphens, c'est quoi déjà? C'est quoi?
Les tirets, je pense.
Ouais.
Je pense que c'est les tirets.
use
Ouais.
this information as career advice. More on that later, unfortunately. Number 4, reasons for citing something. The idea that citation count equals support assumes that the only reason you would cite something is because you agree with it. You can cite a paper that you disagree with to show that it's wrong. I mean, we just looked at an example of people citing Cormandy himself to disprove his work. Should he really be getting important scientist points for that? Number 5, social biases. We all knew it was coming, right? Negative stereotypes about the intelligence and abilities of minoritized groups like women or people of color cause their contributions to be undervalued, leading to fewer citations. Number 6, unequal access to resources. People who are under-resourced will have less opportunities for publication. Publishing in a journal can cost thousands of dollars. Financial access is crucial here. And number 7, citation cartels. This one's my favorite because the name's ridiculous. Like, I promise I didn't make it up. This is actually the word people use. This is when networks of scientists cite each other more often than other people who work on the same thing. And before you assume that this is just a natural result of how networks work, like, yes, to some degree this can happen subconsciously, but let me tell you, I have seen firsthand the lengths that some professors will go to get their students to cite the work of their tennis buddy who works on a totally different topic. It's honestly really sad and gross, but it's real, so. And shady citation practices don't even have to involve networks of people. Cormandy literally cited himself 3 times in this paper he wrote about how citation counts are an objective measure of value. And 2 of those citations are about black holes and galaxies. And just in case it isn't completely obvious that what he's doing here is artificially inflating his own citation count, the slope.
Ça, là, c'est quelque chose, là, moi, quand j'étais à l'université, là, c'était comme. Puis c'est quelque chose que Suzanne Hack, qu'on a lu tantôt, puis d'autres philosophes analytiques sont généralement sont l'exception là-dessus. Pas toutes, là, mais tu sais, c'est plus courant d'avoir peu de citations, mais que tu les as toutes lues. Tu sais, si tu savais comment il y a du monde à l'université là, qui mettent des citations juste pour avoir des pages de citations à la fin du travail, pas des citations, mais des pages de références bibliographiques, mais ils n'ont jamais toutes lu les références bibliographiques qu'ils mettent là-dedans. Là. Jamais dans 100 ans. Là. Jamais ever. Tu sais, des fois, tu regardes. Je te dis, là, moi, des fois, je voyais les références bibliographiques de certaines personnes, genre, mettons, pour les travaux de session, là. Puis j'étais là, tu peux pas avoir lu tout ça dans une session, là, même si t'es bon, là, même si tu lis comme un débile, là, même tu peux pas avoir lu tout ça. Là, t'as pas lu tout ça, là, tu me feras pas croire que t'as lu tout ça. Là. C'est physiquement impossible. Là. Mais il y avait plein de citations parce que plein de références parce que ça paraît bien. T'sais. Il y a juste quelqu'un comme Searle à Berkeley qui dit mets-en 4 là, au lieu d'en mettre 25, puis mets-moi en 4 que tu as lu au complet. Pour la peine. Tu sais, il y en a des fois, ils ont des listes, là, je veux dire, plein d'articles, ok, oui, ça va. Mais tu sais, mettons comme en philo, c'est des livres. Là. Chris, si tu me fais croire là, que dans une session, tu as fait 5 cours là, avec 5 travaux de session, là, puis que dans tes 5 travaux de session, tu as 2 pages de références bibliographiques de book. C'est bon,
Non,
man.
mais ils ont référencé un segment du livre, pas tout le livre.
Non, mais oui, mais généralement, c'est écrit, ça. T'sais, moi, j'en ai vu, là, je te dis, là, du monde qui prétendent avoir lu des briques au complet. Là.
Mm-hmm.
Il y en a.
Normalement, dans ta référence, il faut que tu mettes les pages.
Ouais. Ben, en fait, il faut que tu mettes les pages Juste quand tu cites en note de bas de page, quand tu mets la référence à la fin, faut que tu mettes tout ce que tu as consulté. Fait que,
Ben, de toute façon, sans assumer que personne a mis des choses qu'ils ont lues ou pas, je faisais juste le fait de mettre plus de citations pour mettre plus de citations,
ouais, c'est ça.
va pas nécessairement augmenter la valeur de ce que tu as écrit.
Non.
Mais tu peux dire que c'est sourcé après,
Ah, bah oui, clairement.
par rapport.
Of the black hole mass versus velocity dispersion correlation has categorically nothing to do with evaluating the impact of young scientists. Trust me, I studied black holes. I am literally an expert. No bibliometrics there. You know, nothing there, but especially no bibliometrics. In fact, one of the only references in this paper that actually has anything to do with its contents is an article about how some institutions are abandoning these overly simplified metrics like citation counts in their hiring practices, which would suggest that Cormandy is at least kind of aware of some of the problems of using citation counts to judge somebody's career. But instead of addressing any of them, he just asserts that citation counts, as well as a few other citation-based metrics, are a robust measure of a person's scientific impact. So let's talk about impact. So like I said before, the gist of this paper is that it's trying to show how metrics like citation counts can be used to predict somebody's scientific impact. Which kind of begs the question, how do you measure scientific impact? This is actually a very interesting question. Astronomy is a millennia-old international effort to collectively build a body of knowledge about the universe that we live in. Understanding how a single person contributes to it is no easy.
Ouais, tu sais, c'est ça. Tu sais, tu calcules comme. Parce que des fois, là, tu sais, mettons comme ça, là, l'astronomie, là, tu sais, il y a des choses qui se passent sur des périodes de temps tellement longues que c'est en comparant, mettons, une donnée avec un grec, tu sais, qui a noté quelque chose que, ah, tiens, sur 2000 ans, telle étoile, elle a bougé, tu sais, mais c'est parce c'est parce que le gars, là, 2000 ans, il a fallu qu'il check, tu sais.
Easy task. There are many ways you could approach this question, and many different types of impacts you could think of that different people contribute. Alternatively, you could ignore the interesting questions and nuances here and do what Cormandy did. Basically, he picked two groups of people. The first was a group of 22 voters, and the second was a group of 510 subjects. The 22 voters were astronomers that Cormandy hand-selected as experts in the field. And these 22 excellent astronomers were asked to vote on the impact of the 510 people in the other group. A few notes on these two groups. Of the 22 voters, most of them were American, and almost all of them were old white guys, with the youngest being in their 50s and plenty of them being well into their 80s. You know, people who really have their finger to the pulse. The cutting edge. Also, Cormandy himself was one of the voters. Talk about unbiased. It's wild how many times this guy makes an appearance in his own paper, isn't it? As for the 510 astronomers, I think the important thing to note about them for now is that they did not consent to being in this study. More on that later. So how did the 22 geriatric superstars rate the 510 mere mortals? Honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of this garbage fire of a research paper. I introduce you to the genius scale. Well, that's not what he calls it the Landau-Richter scale, but the thing he's basing it off of is literally called the genius scale. Basically, it's a scale from 1 to 8, with 1 being the bestest specialist Nobel Prize winners, 2 being the more run-of-the-mill Nobel Prize winners, all the way down to 8 for the people who aren't involved in research anymore, presumably because they got sick of the field's fetishistic obsession with Nobel Prize winners. So what else do we have here? 3 is for the top movers and shakers, 5 is a normal successful career, and 7 is for people who used to do lots of research but have since started focusing on non-research contributions. And I think that last one really starts to indicate some of the problems with this scale. Presumably, this is supposed to rate how an individual has contributed to advancing the collective knowledge of the field, right? But it incorrectly assumes that publishing papers is the only way to do that. If you're a great teacher who has inspired students to go on and do research, you have indirectly contributed to the advancement of the field. If you mentor young scientists and they publish work, you have advanced the field. If you
Oui, écoute, moi, quand j'étais en philo, là, on voyait clairement la différence entre ceux qui s'en allaient, mettons, faire de la recherche, de ceux qui s'en allaient enseigner la philo. Puis ça prenait des deux, là, tu sais. Ceux qui voulaient faire de la recherche, ils aimaient mieux traiter les trucs par question, tu sais, du genre, telle question philosophique, qu'est-ce que tel puis tel auteur en a dit. Puis les gens qui voulaient s'en aller prof de philo, eux autres, c'était plus, eux autres, ils veulent avoir de quoi de synthétique puis de concis pour apprendre comme faut tel auteur. Tu sais. Fait qu'eux autres, ils aimaient mieux fonctionner par auteur, tu sais. C'est pas un field là, d'études à l'université, c'est pas monolithique, là. Même en dehors des domaines purement scientifiques, là.
You create opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to do research, you have increased participation in the field.
Chronique, il dit, j'ai une question. Si je veux aller sur la philosophie, vous me conseillez de commencer par qui ou par quoi? Je te dirais quel genre quel sujet tu t'intéresses. C'est surtout ça la question.
Ouais, c'est quand même large, la
Ouais, oui,
philosophie.
c'est large, c'est tout. Puis
If you help create laws that increase access to STEM education, help researchers at a laboratory unionize, or become a public figure who challenges the societal expectations of who is and who isn't a scientist, you are broadening the possibility for people to do the kinds of research that Cormandy is narrowly defining as having an impact. Science might study vacuums, but it doesn't exist in one. To put this into perspective, if you put Carl Sagan's citation counts into Cormandy's machinery, he'd barely have an impact score of 4, barely above a normal successful career. Keep in mind that countless astronomers
ben écoute, je te dirais, vu le caractère politique de la chaîne ici, si je dirais, il y a bien des trucs politiques tu sais, qui peuvent, je vais dire, qui peuvent résonner avec notre situation actuelle, là, tu sais, parce qu'il y a des affaires, des fois, tu fais comme, ouais, ok, là, c'est intéressant, mais tu sais.
Dans les quelques livres que je possède, il y a un des livres, ça s'appelle Philographics. En fait, j'ai jamais. Je me rappelle pas du nom de l'auteur, là, mais bref, c'est un concis de genre, je pense 180 ou quelque chose de même, genre différentes branches de la philosophie, genre avec une description de c'est quoi, puis avec des graphiques qui sont vraiment bien faits, genre, puis genre, ça fait une espèce de bonne mnémonique pour essayer, genre, classifier les différentes branches de philosophie, là.
Ben écoute, moi j'ai un site qui est un peu de même, ça s'appelle The Basic of Philosophy. J'ai utilisé ça pour faire certaines des définitions que j'ai utilisées à soir. Tu sais, c'est pas, là, tu sais, tu fais pas un travail de recherche avec ça, là, mais tu sais, si t'as envie de commencer à lire, là, comme chronique, il parle, ça peut te guider vers qu'est-ce qui va t'intéresser de lire. Je vais le mettre dans le Discord, mais je vais vous le mettre dans le chat ici aussi en même temps.
Parce que ça, tu trouves une branche, mettons, puis là,
Ouais,
tu décides d'approfondir cette branche-là parce que c'est une question que tu trouves bien
c'est ça.
évocative, là. Puis là, à partir de là, tu peux avoir des conseils de différents philosophes là, dans cette branche-là, là.
C'est ça. Tu sais, comme moi, par
Je dis
exemple,
ça en tant que personne qui lit pas vraiment, là, mais je peux te conseiller des vidéos, par contre.
mais regarde, tu sais, moi, personnellement, tu sais, j'ai accroché sur tout ce qui était philo-analytique, puis même, je dirais, toutes les considérations du langage, même si en tout cas, il y a des
Tu
débats à
mettras ça
savoir.
dans le Discord, dans la
Ouais,
bibliothèque, là, c'est
ouais,
intéressant. J'aime bien la façon, genre, tu sais, c'est classé de
oui,
différentes façons, là. Fait que, genre,
ouais,
tu vas l'avoir par philosophe, puis là, ils
exact.
vont te dire c'est quoi leurs écoles, ou tu peux l'avoir par
Mhm,
école, puis après ça, ils vont te dire
c'est
c'est
ça,
qui les philosophes
exactement. Ben,
influents dans cette
ouais.
école.
Oui, oui, c'est très intéressant, ce site-là. Puis, tu sais, il est assez. J'ai checké, là. En tout cas, à date, tout ce sur quoi je suis tombé, c'est fiable. Ça tourne. Tu sais, c'est pas trop compliqué, puis ça tourne pas trop les coins ronds non plus, là. Il y a un bon juste milieu. Puis, ah non, c'est quand même très intéressant. Puis,
Ouais, philosophie pour les nuls.
ouais.
Je sais pas si ça existe, en fait, mais probablement.
Je pense que oui, ça existe. Mais tu sais, c'est ça. Tu sais, des fois, là, tu lis des affaires. Tu sais, des fois, on réalise pas à quel point on stand sur les shoulders of giants, mais des fois, tu vas lire ces giants-là. Tu sais, il y a des affaires par rapport à l'organisation de la cité grecque, là.
Ouais, mais c'est pas un géant, c'est un conglomérat de plusieurs
C'est ça.
autres personnes avant.
Non, mais
Personne en soi-même qui a été un géant parce qu'ils sont tous sur les épaules d'un autre géant
ouais.
avant.
Ben oui, puis ben, je te dirais, moi, te dire de quoi, ceux qui sont passés d'une explication mythologique à une tu sais, supranaturelle au monde qui s'explique par lui-même, comme on voyait tantôt, m'a dire de quoi, là, ça, euh, c'était un des plus gros steps dans l'histoire de l'humanité. Même on regarde ça, là, mettons après coup, là, 2500 ans plus tard, là, puis on se dit, malgré tout ce qu'on a pensé, indépendamment de comment qu'on pourra trouver brillant ce qu'on a pensé après ça, c'est comme les, les pas après ça sont tellement des micro-steps comparés à ça que c'est comme
Ouais,
on a fait un
moi,
asti de
ça n'a pas dû
pont.
arriver tout d'un coup non plus, là. Peut-être que
euh,
c'est juste on trace la
ben,
ligne de ces penseurs-là jusqu'à l'Antiquité, puis avant ça, on perd la ligne, là. Mais peut-être qu'il y en a eu d'autres des penseurs avant eux autres aussi.
je veux dire, c'est pas drastique, genre, ils se sont pas levés un lendemain, une journée puis le lendemain, mais ça s'est fait relativement rapidement là, à l'échelle des choses, là.
Parce que aussi la mythologie puis la superstition ont continué
Oui,
à
oui,
coexister
oui.
aussi pendant ce temps-là.
Oui,
C'est
là,
pas,
là,
c'est pas, je veux dire,
on parle de ce qui avait lieu dans les cercles intellectuels, là, c'est pas la masse du
j'accorde,
peuple, là.
j'accorde pas zéro valeur non plus à la mythologie et la superstition, là.
Ouais, non, non, on n'est pas religiophobe ici à
Mhm.
l'Antipode. Même que moi, ça m'énerve le monde religiophobe.
Members today were inspired to do what they do because of Sagan's public facing work, meaning his non research work. Surely any good measure of
Mais, excuse, quand même, je vais l'arrêter, mais Chronique, je vais quand même te suggérer, en termes de trucs politiques qui résonnent avec notre époque, puis qui n'est pas trop chiant à lire, Le Prince de Machiavel, c'est assez basic, là. C'est...
C'est tellement chiant.
Hein? T'as trouvé ça chiant?
Moi, je l'ai pas lu, là, mais c'est tout ce qui sort de ça, c'est des affaires de Edgelord, là. Whatever.
Ah, ouais, non, non, mais là.
C'est surtout des Edgelord qui les référencent, là.
Ah,
Ouais.
ouais, non, mais c'est
Ah.
parce... Ouais, ouais, je comprends ce que tu veux dire. Ouais, non.
C'est un peu comme quand ils sortent Sun Tzu, là.
Ouais, non, mais là. Ça, c'est juste pour ça, c'est juste pour plug un nom, là. Je veux dire, gars, au début de la pandémie, là, il y a un conspi qui est venu se planter devant moi, là. Il m'a plugué Staline, Hitler puis Mussolini back à back, là. J'ai déjà entendu la vieille Chris de dire que c'était de qui a parlé? C'était je me rappelle plus trop, Rothschild ou whatever quoi, là, que c'était le mix entre Machiavel et Rasputin. Tu sais, elle a juste voulu plugger ces deux noms-là. C'est n'importe quoi. Non, non,
J'essaie de m'imaginer ce que ça donne, là, un mix entre Machiavel et Rasputin.
non,
Je veux dire, ça dépend ce que tu penses de Rasputin, parce que tu peux très bien dire que, je veux dire, Rasputin était machiavélique
ouais.
lui-même.
Mais
Pas
c'est quoi,
besoin de...
mais c'est quoi une des personnes les moins machiavéliques au monde, c'était Machiavel. C'est ça l'ironie, en tout cas. Mais bref. Euh, Mais je te dirais, non, c'est parce que ce qui est intéressant en lisant Le Prince de Machiavel, c'est que tu vois vraiment comment je vais dire, les politiciens d'aujourd'hui se maintiennent au pouvoir, là.
Uh-huh.
C'est,
Parce que les politiciens d'aujourd'hui, c'est les mêmes que les politiciens d'hier. Voilà.
oui, mais je te dirais la manière dont, je vais dire, les formes de gouvernement évoluaient à l'époque de Machiavel. Tu sais, tu te maintiens pas au pouvoir de la même manière dans une
Non, c'est
république que
sûr que
dans une...
ça s'appelle le prince, ça s'appelle pas le président.
Ouais, non, c'est ça. Ben, oui, oui,
Mais
mais...
je veux dire, c'est genre, c'est le real politique pis toutes ces affaires-là. Ça m'énerve. Ça m'irrite, moi, genre, c'est genre...
De quoi ça? Qu'est-ce que tu veux dire, le real
Le,
politique?
ben, ces affaires-là, là, le genre... les conflits d'intérêts entre les États, puis ces affaires-là, là, puis genre, c'est... j'ai de la misère à l'écrire, là, mais Machiavel, whatever.
Ben, moi, m'a dit, ben,
I'm
franchement,
over it. I'm over it. Genre, c'est comme la géopolitique, là. Ce sujet-là, ça m'irrite.
ouais, non, mais moi écoute, m'a dit de quoi, ce que ça m'a permis, ce que ça m'a donné comme capacité d'analyse du comportement de nos politiciens et de nos hommes d'affaires, parce que
Mhm.
ça compte, je te dirais que c'est comme. Tu sais,
Oh, si tu veux comprendre les politiciens modernes, tu peux lire Mein Kampf aussi, puis tu vas comprendre des
ouais,
bouts, là.
ouais, mais tu peux lire Le Prince de Machiavel aussi.
Ouais, non,
Puis,
c'est probablement mieux de lire Le
je te
Prince.
dis, écoute, je te dirais que je commence à lire des gens tu sais, des antifascistes qui réfèrent à Mein Kampf parce qu'ils analysent le discours nazi. Je suis à la veille d'avoir le goût de le lire parce que, ben, pas le goût, mais que je dis que j'aurais pas le choix parce que j'ai le goût de comprendre ce que je suis en train de lire. Mais Chris, que je me dis que ça va être infect.
Je sais pas.
Et,
Paraît que la prose est excellente.
paraît qu'Hitler faisait un bon pâté chinois aussi.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Impact should be able to see that that's more than
Ah non, mais j'ai commencé à lire Michel Werner. Sacrément que c'est infect. C'est vraiment infect.
the normal successful career, right? Even if we were to adopt Cormandy's deeply individual definition of impact, it's still rife with problems. A big one being the assumption of inherent and static brilliance. There's this idea in education of what's called fixed mindset versus growth mindset. Basically, someone with a fixed mindset thinks that things like intelligence and ability are static and inherent, whereas somebody with a growth mindset thinks people can grow. Knowledge can be taught, skills can be learned, and a person's ability at something can increase. Rather than try to argue which of these two mindsets I think is correct, I'm just going to show you a study that found that the racial achievement gaps in courses taught by more fixed mindset faculty were twice as large as the achievement gaps in courses taught by more growth mindset faculty. Furthermore, disciplines with a higher cultural emphasis on innate brilliance have lower proportions of women. Unless you think physics somehow demands more sheer genius than something like neuroscience, I'd point out that the neuroscientists probably know a little bit more about how intelligence works. And let's not even pretend that these guys can be objective judges of brilliance. We all know that implicit bias is still a thing, right? Lab managers consistently rate men as more competent, hireable, and deserving higher salaries than women with identical applications. Professors are more willing to mentor white students than students of other races with identical credentials. And just in case that you think the voters were trying really extra hard to be objective, a person who believes they're making objective judgments of somebody else's ability is actually more likely to make decisions based on stereotypes. Bias is kind of like a Chinese finger trap. If you try to brute force your way out of it, it's just going to squeeze harder.
Tu sais, là, comme on disait tantôt, les scientifiques, ils se vantent pas d'être scientifiques. Ben là, c'est un peu la même chose avec l'objectivité. Tu sais, plus tu penses que tu es objectif, plus tu te vantes que tu es objectif, plus dans la vraie vie, tu ne l'es pas vraiment. Ou en tout cas, pas autant que tu penses.
Do we really think these guys are somehow immune to all of that? I actually know a couple of these guys, and I don't want to say that they're bad people or anything. I really don't think that. But the idea that they could unbiasedly rank hundreds of astronomers is funny to me. In conclusion, this whole genius scale thing is deeply subject to the biases of the voters, trying to simplify a highly complex and dynamic thing like ability or intelligence, and it completely ignores the many ways that people can contribute to a field that aren't just publishing research papers. But rather than challenge these factors that have been proven to create inequity, Cormandy reifies them, reducing his subjects' achievements to a single static number. On a scale from Morty Smith to Rick Sanchez, how much of a genius are you? Okay, we're almost at the tea part, I promise, but like, real quick, let's just synthesize this literature review. Let's look at this graph. It's a good meme. For each of the 510 sample researchers, a point shows their voted upon impact plotted against their citation counts. He fits a line to the data and says that because he can do that, one could theoretically predict a researcher's future impact by using this equation. Just plug in the number of citations and boom, you got their genius number. He includes these little labels on the side of the graph to help guide the use of the data, that is, to provide calibration of standards for postdoctoral fellowships and tenure stream faculty. And that's basically the whole paper. Cormandy took one demonstrably biased measure of career impact, plotted it against another, even more egregiously biased measure of career impact, and said,
incroyablement circulaire
this
aussi,
must
là.
be an objective way to determine.
Genre,
oui, c'est ça.
le métrique qui a fait que eux autres sont considérés comme des sommités, genre, c'est le même métrique que eux autres vont utiliser pour faire leur échelle, genre, c'est comme...
C'est ça qu'il est en train d'expliquer. Il met je vais dire, en interaction une variable avec une autre. il mesure l'effet de ces variables-là une sur l'autre, puis il dit qu'il a découvert une nouvelle patente. Tu sais?
Moi, je suis sommité en fromage, fait que je vais rater les pizzas en quantité de fromage. Parce que je suis une sommité en fromage. J'aime ça le fromage, fait que là, je vais juger de la fromageité d'une série de pizzas. Puis là, comme ça, on va tous savoir c'est lesquelles les meilleures pizzas en fonction du genre. Étant donné que je suis une sommité en fromage, ben, c'est moi qui décide après ça combien de fromage. Donc, quelle pizza a le plus de fromage? C'est super objectif.
C'est comme si je faisais chauffer de l'eau puis que je te disais que j'avais découvert qu'il y avait une relation proportionnelle ou en tout cas, tu sais, qui suit telle curve entre la quantité de chaleur dégagée puis le. Tu sais, puis là, je vais dire, on va dire la quantité d'eau qui a bouilli, puis qu'après ça, je faisais l'inverse. Tu sais. Je te disais, ben là, j'ai découvert que la quantité d'eau qui est bouillie,
La quantité de bouilleur a une
bouillage est comme.
corrélation
Ouais, c'est ça,
avec.
tu sais. Et le produit de la chaleur. Ben oui, mais dude, c'est sûr, Asti. Tu sais, c'est
Mais
comme
ça,
ça.
c'était plus l'affaire de tantôt, là. La
Oui,
curve de comparaison entre
entre les galaxies, ben oui, mais c'est le même problème ici. Tu vas voir, on va
genre,
l'expliquer.
diffuse une source d'énergie, puis elle va être plus diffuse. OK, bravo.
Ben oui, c'est ça, tu sais. Écoute, il y a une relation entre le fait qu'une lumière est plus diffuse puis le fait qu'on mesure une lumière plus diffuse. No shit.
Ouais, c'est ça. Ça reste la même lumière. On le savait déjà.
On le
Mais bon,
savait déjà.
t'es un génie. À cette heure,
Ouais, c'est
va
ça.
décider. À cette heure qu'on a décidé que t'es un génie, va décider. Va te faire une échelle de qui est le plus
De qui est le
génie.
plus génial? Exact.
Who we should hire. Does this look familiar? That is, to provide calibration of standards for postdoctoral fellowships and tenure stream faculty. And that's basically the whole paper. Cormandy took one demonstrably biased measure of career impact, plotted it against another, even more egregiously biased measure of career impact, and said, look, they match. This must be an objective way to determine who we should hire. Does this look familiar? Have we seen this before? Remember his debunked galaxy stuff from 10 minutes ago? Remember when he found a new and exciting relation between one thing and a second thing that's basically just an indirect measure of the first thing? He's done it again. But this time, instead of it being a nonsense relation that informs models of galactic.
C'est ça, tu sais, avec bon exemple de l'eau tout à l'heure. Si on sait que, tu sais, mettons, la chaleur, mettons, je sais pas moi, pour chaque BTU qui est communiqué à l'eau, il va s'évaporer tant d'eau. Ben, je vais prendre une mesure de l'humidité dans la pièce au fur et à mesure que l'eau bouille. Puis là, je vais dire, j'ai découvert une relation entre la chaleur et l'humidité dans la pièce.
Evolution, it's a nonsense relation that informs who we should hire as a researcher. In other words, it actually matters now. Now, I want to be fair. He does pay a little bit of lip service to some of the problems with this. In the section where he advises how to use his results, he says, decisions about hiring and tenure should be and are made more holistically, weighing factors metrics do not measure. He also goes on to talk about how heightened awareness of the importance of inclusivity has the result that institutions put special emphasis on redressing historically underrepresented cohorts. And that's all well and good. The problem is that he completely undermines this attention to inequity by saying that we should use his metric machinery to reduce hiring decisions from a few hundred applicants to a few tens of applicants and then make holistic decisions. In other words, if you can make it past my genius filter, then and only then will we consider anything else about you. This seems like a natural point in the video to talk about meritocracy. And maybe from what I've already said, you've started to get the sense that perhaps the decisions that determine who becomes a scientist and who doesn't aren't as based in objective differences in ability as we sometimes think they are. And you'd be right. Lots of people much smarter than I am have already debunked the myth of meritocracy in science and the world more broadly. This is not a particularly hot take. I mean, there was a guy who almost faked his way to winning a Nobel Prize in physics, straight up catch me if you can style. Something that scammable is necessarily not meritocratic. But I think what makes this paper and what it says about meritocracy especially interesting is what happened after it was published.
عرفت أحلم وأغني بعد ما كنت قبلك
So when this paper went live, it had already been peer-reviewed and accepted into a pretty high-profile journal, but it hadn't yet been published. Instead, the world was introduced to Cormandy's intellectual spawn via Archive, an open-access e-print website. People publish their work on Archive before it's published for real so that the scientific community can interact with their work. If you're a researcher in physics or astronomy, you probably start your days by looking at the Archive. Well, let's be honest, you probably start your day checking for new XKCD, but then you check the Archive so that you can stay current on new research papers, maybe engage with something by talking about it to a colleague, or perhaps tweeting about it. And tweet about it they did. There were many long, detailed Twitter threads about how the whole predictive machinery thing is rife with statistical mistakes that are actually pretty common in astronomy, like how you can't use a full data set to train a predictive model because you need some other data that the model wasn't trained on to test the predictive ability. Others took issues with some of the biases in the methodology I touched on earlier, like how the makeup of voters would inevitably perpetuate the very same bias that the paper claims to be able to solve. Still others brought up the ethical implications of a study like this. Grants and tenure reviews require consent of the person being reviewed, but the 510 researchers in this sample
Ouais, tu sais, ils ont eux-mêmes été élevés à leur statut en étant cités souvent, fait qu'ils ont tendance à dire ben, c'est ça qui fait que je mérite mon statut, donc c'est à
Mhm.
l'autre de ça qu'ils vont juger les autres.
Ben ouais, c'est la même affaire que genre le gospel de la prospérité, là, genre. J'ai
Euh,
du succès, donc je dois être une bonne personne, là, genre.
euh,
C'est ça.
were not asked to participate, nor were they made aware that somewhere these guys were making deliberations on their merit. The most damning tweets were probably the ones from voters on the paper who tried to distance themselves from Cormandy once they realized what the paper was actually about. Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt, I wonder if he was an extra special #1 kind of Nobel laureate or one of the basic #2 kinds, tweeted an apology where he explained that he thought his participation would help address concerns about the overuse of citations in assessing researchers. Basically, the exact opposite of what the paper actually did. It kind of makes you wonder how Cormandy pitched his project to the people he enlisted as experts, doesn't it? Now, as far as I'm aware, Cormandy is not and was not on Twitter when all this was going down, so naturally, he didn't respond to any of the tweeted criticisms. Instead, he withdrew the submission from the journal and halted publication of his book that the paper was based on. He updated the archive page to not display the paper with a comment that reads, "This preprint is being criticized based on a perception that it furthers bias against women and minorities." Along with all these retractions, he published an apology on his personal website. His apology was basically half a statement of very good intentions, and then saying that intentions don't matter. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, but I really...
Puis de mémoire, c'était même pas ça directement qui est
Non, c'est
reproché.
ça, c'est comme genre. Ah non, je suis pas raciste, je suis pas sexiste. Non, non. Regarde, j'ai même mis le disclaimer. Non, pourquoi tu me critiques? Je suis pas raciste, je suis pas sexiste. Ouais, mais c'est pas de ça qu'on parlait, mais genre,
Ouais.
on va peut-être en parler à cette heure que t'en
T'sais,
parles, par raison.
on disait que
Non, je suis pas raciste.
Ouais, non, c'est ça. Ce qu'on disait, c'est que ton truc, pour vérifier que ça marche, ça nous prend un deuxième set de données qui vient pas de ton test. Tu sais, genre un
Hey,
groupe
ça sent-
contrôle, là, tu sais.
Ça sent le pet un peu. Non, non, j'ai pas de cadavre dans mon, mon sol. Quoi? On peut-tu parler des cadavres?
Ouais, c'est ça.
really didn't mean it. Which, I don't know, maybe somebody somewhere feels a little bit better because Cormandy said sorry. But what none of this does is actually address the criticisms of his work. He does not refute or even acknowledge the statistical, methodological, or ethical critiques of his paper, instead choosing to focus on the stress his offensiveness caused, I guess. And this angle is really important to keep in mind with what happened next. Instead of publishing the usual back and forth, the paper is withdrawn and this sort of apology is demanded. Read it now because he wrote a Maoist apology and will cancel his paper. Mea culpa belong to religion, not science. The gist is that a particular type of person on Twitter was furious at Cormandy.
Mais il
s'est
a pas
fait
été
cancel
cancellé, c'est
culturé.
lui qui l'a enlevé. Il s'est auto-cancellé comme une caquette.
Non, mais à cause, c'est soit une commande politique ou à cause du
Ouais.
harassment
Ah,
par les
ben
méchants
ouais.
activistes, whatever. Non,
Mais ça, c'est pas,
sûr, c'est tout le
mais
temps
ça,
ça.
mais ça, c'est pas du clickbait pour sa merde. C'est pas pour faire parler de lui pantoute.
Non, ouais, c'est
Non, ouais.
le clickbait, c'est ceux qui font le clickbait.
Ouais.
Après ça, genre lui,
Ouais.
il est juste,
Ouais.
Il a juste sauté comme aux conclusions un petit peu trop vite, là. Genre, parce qu'en même temps, c'est vrai que c'est ça que ça fait, mais on n'a pas dit que tu avais fait ça volontairement. Genre, c'est juste que, ouais, genre, ça va un peu fausser tes données, genre, mais pas. En tout cas,
Hey,
c'est-
statistiquement, c'est un petit peu faible. Tu sais. Hey, je suis pas raciste, comme tu dis.
c'est ça.
Withdrawal. The narrative basically went, Cormandy published a perfectly legitimate
ils m'ont
paper
cancellé parce
asking
qu'ils me
perfectly
disent que je suis
legitimate
raciste.
questions. Offended activists demanded he say sorry for triggering them, and we're upset because he bowed to the whims of cancel culture and withdrew his paper rather than publishing the usual back and forth. And it didn't just stop at the tweets. There were whole blog posts and op-eds about diversity run amok in science, foreshadowing the end of rationality as we know it, all thanks to these sensitive snowflakes! Probably the most high-profile of these op-eds came from Lawrence Krauss, famous theoretical physicist and notorious skeptic creep who repeats a lot of the same talking points. Snowflakes got upset and forced the legitimate scientist asking legitimate questions into submission. He also literally points out that this is not his area of expertise, but okay sis, go off. But there is one bit of Krauss's piece that I actually agree with. He says, by the standards of modern cancel culture, the online barrage of criticism against Cormandy did not seem especially ferocious. Unlike other furs, this one did not feature virally circulated demands for his sacking or other forms of cancellation. Which is true. The tweets engaged with his work, and I didn't see any calls to withdraw, fire, or otherwise cancel Cormandy. And trust me, if there had been, I would have seen it. I'm not even on Twitter, but I spent that day I like that I got to use my space mug for this bit. Do you know how many of these people have given to me over the years? It's like people don't know what gift to get an astronomer besides space mug. Krauss goes on, surely there must have been some other pressure coming to bear on Cormandy because he not only retracted his published paper and put further publication of his book on hold, but he also posted an apology whose language seemed out of all proportion to his actions. Which, yes. Krauss acknowledges that nobody was trying to cancel Cormandy, but he still lands at the conclusion that he, or somebody with authority over him, was swayed by the online tempest. And this is where I diverge from Krauss. I mean, it's this and the fact that I've never received research funding from Jeffrey Epstein, but that's just me. None of the Twitter critics told Cormandy to withdraw his paper. Nobody was calling on his institution to fire him. No one was demanding the publisher reject his work. If anything, there were people like me who were preparing to write rebuttal papers, to participate in that back and forth that the Twitter reactionaries were asking for. So why, instead of responding to criticism and actually participating in academic
le travail normal de la
dialogue,
science,
did
là, se
Cormandy
répondre, puis
withdraw the paper?
tu sais, un débat public, mais tu sais, pas du genre de ceux des fascistes, là, du genre de ceux entre experts qui se connaissent sur un sujet, puis que, tu sais, le peer review,
Mais je pense que son réflexe défensif, c'est juste parce qu'il a senti que, justement, genre, sa core value, c'est
Ouais,
son assumption que sa position dans l'élite
ouais.
académique, c'est le fait de la méritocratie. Puis, genre, de se faire attaquer sur sa méritocratie, ça lui ferait plus mal que de se faire attaquer sur ses biais intrinsèques. Genre, personne n'attaque là-dessus, là. On fait juste te dire, dude, t'es un blanc d'un certain âge, t'as probablement des biais intrinsèques, puis ça vaut la peine de les
Mm.
explorer, genre, mais genre, c'était moins payé pour lui de genre justement pour genre
Ouais, s'auto-canceller.
s'auto-tel
S'auto-canceller
s'auto-tel
plutôt que c'est, ouais.
comme raciste puis miso genre que pas méritocratique genre ça serait plus dommageable
Ouais,
au
ouais.
fondement de sa psychologie.
Ok, ouais, ouais. Ouais, ouais, parce que, tu sais, il y a mieux être raciste puis misogyne que de supposer qu'il est un fake, tu sais.
Ouais, ou même pas qu'il est un fake, juste genre, il est là à cause plus de happenstance que de
Qui est
son
pas un
génie,
genius, tu
tu
sais,
sais.
ouais, c'est ça.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Qui
Que
est pas
c'est pas
autant
méritocratique, tu
Ouais,
sais. Que c'est genre. Il pourrait avoir la même quantité de génie puis pas être à cette position-là, tu sais.
genre.
Donc, les gens qui sont pas dans sa position pourraient pas
Et-
avoir
mm.
pourraient avoir la même quantité de génie, la même place sur le genius scale que lui, mais on ne saura jamais. Ça fuck toute son affaire, genre, parce que là, à partir de. Si tu reconnais que c'est pas une méritocratie, ben genre, ton étude
Ça vaut plus
fout le
rien,
camp,
c'est
oui.
ça.
Non, dans tous les cas, enlève ton étude, c'est de la merde.
Ouais,
Finalement, genre, peu importe comment tu roules ça, t'as aussi bien de l'enlever, ton esti d'étude. C'est vraiment...
c'est dans ce sens-là que ça s'en va, check bien ça.
De la façon qu'elle est flawed, genre, ça ruine même la raison de son existence. T'es aussi bien d'être raciste. Rendu là. Rase-toi, tatoue une swastika, vas-y, go, t'es aussi bien
But in
d'être
my
raciste.
opinion,
C'est pas... T'as manqué ta shot.
Comment que Pierre il disait ça l'autre fois quand on a écouté le dude là, qui virait sur le fâche, tu sais, qui disait qu'il avait détransitionné, là, qui a dit toi, tu serais mieux de te raser le crâne puis de porter des bottes de cuir. Ah non, de lever le bras puis de porter des bottes de cuir. Oui, c'est ça qu'il a dit.
Des saluts à 45 degrés.
the worst thing about it isn't that it's insensitive or offensive or even harmful. It's that it's true. What Cormandy has done here is outline the explicit bias that exists in hiring, admissions, and the awarding of grants, and results in the field of astronomy looking like this. He has mapped out an existing systemic preference based on flawed ideas of genius and an obsession with objectivity, and rather than challenge its causes, which he seems to know exist, endorses it and advises how we can automate it. Cormandy didn't offend snowflakes. He told on himself. He took a deeply cultural and social phenomena that many marginalized astronomers are already far too familiar with, called it an objective analysis, and said, hey, let's do more of this. And he didn't just show us how traditional markers of success keep minoritized people from advancing in the field. He also gave us some really depressing insight about what makes successful people successful. Like, at the end of the paper, he offers some advice to young scientists on what it takes to be successful and what metric numbers are associated with postdoc and faculty hires. But it basically all boils down to how to game the system. He says this research will help make decisions on what work they undertake that make it possible to write better papers. But he never once actually talks about what makes a good paper. If we were to run with the advice of high citation count equals success, what are we actually incentivized to do? Focusing on the length of your title and what punctuation you use instead of if your work actually has any value? Only researching safe and surefire publishable topics instead of thinking about something new? Refusing to work with other people, or even worse, not crediting other people that you did work with because having more than one author on your paper would diminish your celebrity? Is this really how we want to be telling young scientists how to achieve success? It all feels so cynical to me, and it really reflects what I've come to understand as the strategy for success in astronomy. Don't prioritize your teaching, don't bother mentoring anybody, don't waste your time on science communication, and honestly, don't even worry too much about whether or not your work is valuable to anyone. Just get your name on as many papers as possible. If you've ever seen the show Succession, you might have already had that, horrifying real.
C'est même étendu au département, au sens où les départements reçoivent de l'argent en fonction du nombre de publications de professeurs. Fait qu'il y a des professeurs qui se font engager juste parce qu'ils publient beaucoup.
En grande partie, le but de la science dans le contexte actuel, c'est de se publier. C'est de faire du matériel à publier pour recevoir plus de...
Plus de cash pour faire...
Plus de cash pour faire plus de matériel, c'est ça.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Mais ça, c'est pas la faute de la science, ça. C'est la faute au capitalisme,
Ouais.
puis au modèle qu'on utilise en ce moment.
Oui, le modèle entrepreneurial de l'université.
Genre.
You find out that the people who are at the top of whatever field aren't there because they're the smartest.
I don't, at this time, recall anything that at that time would have caused me a real concern.
Or the most hardworking.
Hey, get out of jail free card. Another one.
They're the most talented.
Thank you, Greg.
Yes!
It's just that they're the ones who are willing to do anything to get to the top.
You have to be a killer.
And if you haven't watched Succession, literally, what are you doing here? Go watch it. Go watch it now. It's important. But seriously, science is no different than business or politics or Hollywood. From a distance, we see people like Nobel Prize winners and we think they're gods, but then we get up close to them and it's just... disappointing. Basically, if there was anyone who actually had an incentive to cancel Cormandy, it wasn't activists. It's the gauntlet of old astronomers trying to maintain the facade of objective meritocracy that grants them legitimacy, power, and lucrative careers. I don't think there's some shadowy cabal of old astronomers who have these meetings where they decide who they promote and who they silence in order to maintain their rule. It's not like that. At least I don't think. I'm just trying to point out who actually benefits from his withdrawal, because it's not the critics. If anything, the paper would have helped activists point out flaws in a system and support arguments to reform scientific institutions. In my experience, it's been so hard to convince people in astronomy that the field can be biased in any way, because they'll point to objective data that matches their personal opinion and not realize that the objective data is literally also based in people's personal opinion. It's the Cormandy relation all over again. Remember? Like, no duh, you're gonna find a trend if you measure 2 instances of the same thing twice. Sure, you can objectively count the number of citations a person has, but that doesn't mean that those citations were not created with any bias. Like, I know that astronomers suck at statistics, but don't we at least know that correlation does not imply causation? I mean, come on, this is embarrassing for y'all. And that's really why I think he took it down. Because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to institutional power. And just in case you think I'm starting to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I'm not the only one who thinks this. Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto, a Georgia Tech professor of information science who studies how knowledge is processed and disseminated, spoke on this whole debacle saying,
"We create a dangerous precedent for withdrawing works that are controversial, but perhaps not inaccurate. Science builds on the interaction with previous work, either reinforcing or contradicting. We cannot engage meaningfully in this dialogue if controversy is met with retraction rather than debate. We should use retractions and withdrawals when necessary and with precision, lest it become a chilling effect for empirical dialogue."
Chilling indeed. If Cormandy hadn't retracted the paper, people could have pointed to it as evidence of the bias that exists in hiring practices and published their own response to it. I actually started outlining my own response immediately after seeing this paper. Like, 3 different people independently sent it to me the day it came out because they knew I would be all over that. I was honestly so excited about what a slam dunk this paper was going to be, because unlike the subtle, coded forms of discrimination you usually see in academia, in this paper, Cormandy just said the quiet part out loud, but because he retracted it, it's like nothing ever happened. I can't participate in that back and forth that the Twitter reactionaries wanted because, as far as academic journals are concerned, the paper doesn't exist. By withdrawing this paper, Cormandy shielded himself from what would have been an onslaught of scholarship using his work of evidence as the kinds of racist, sexist systems that people like me are trying to dismantle in academia. But instead, I'm here talking about it on YouTube.com, and as a super fun bonus, the reactionaries get yet another example of progressive activists trying to silence the scientists who are just trying to do their job. We just can't win, can we? So what have we learned on this journey? Well, I think one thing is that it's an interesting case study in how the idea of cancel culture manifests. I'm not here to say whether it exists or doesn't exist or whether it's good or bad. I just think it's interesting. Molly, shut up. I just think it's interesting that an event widely interpreted as activists trying to cancel a scientist was actually a scientific community critiquing a work legitimately, and then the author withdrawing it, probably to protect his own interests and stifle further conversation of his horrible, horrible take. You can actually see a similar thing playing out in, for example, politics. Power will silence individuals who make it look bad, who lay out all the nastiness for the world to see. So, be on the lookout for that in basically everything. The other lesson is that, despite what some people really want to think, scientific institutions are just not meritocratic. They're just not. I'm sorry, they're not. We all want them to be. I know we do, but they're not. And this is really important. Like, I've been in so many conversations where people get stuck on this point of, sure, we want to make science more inclusive, but how do we do that while maintaining our true meritocracy? My dudes, you were never meritocratic to begin with. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that everybody who has a job in research didn't deserve it. I know lots of people who are very brilliant who are recognized and rewarded for their work, and I love that for them. But I also know some people who are very brilliant and haven't been recognized or rewarded for their work, and I also know some people who have been recognized and rewarded for work that might not have earned that if things didn't work the way they did. I have met many a scientist who is unwilling to accept this fact. If I had to guess, I think maybe it's sometimes that we put a lot of self-worth in our success, and so to examine how success is distributed might mean questioning your own self-worth. And that's very hard to do. I feel that. I've been there, I promise. But this data is really hard to argue with. Cormandy's paper proves to us that the single-dimensional opinion of these guys will literally predict your success. And even beyond this paper, there is so much evidence to show the absolute bullshit that determines who is successful in a field like astronomy. Or even other fields that actually matter. Because astronomy sure don't matter. Future video. Cormandy even seems like he's aware of this. In the last few sentences of the paper, he disclaims, "I emphasize again that metrics measure the impact that happens, not the impact that should happen. It helps us to understand what happens in the real world. The real world is the only one that we have to live in." His understanding that metrics are a measure of what does happen instead of what should happen would mean a whole lot more if he hadn't just spent a whole paper arguing that we should double down on the use of metrics to decide who gets jobs. I mean, he's right. This is what happens in the real world. But unlike Cormandy, I'm not stuck believing that the world and the people in it can't change. I mean, our YouTube auntie says it all the time.
And remember, please remember that you can always change your mind. Because you can.
They're so cool. Can we be friends? If you want to get hung up on the fact that this is the world we live in, fine. Be my guest. You do you, boo. But some of us are gonna be over here trying to fix it. Welcome to the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and thanks for the response to my first video. Like, I'm recording this not a week after posting it, and I already have like 500 subscribers.
C'est la fin de Subscriber. Je pense qu'à moins que toi aies besoin d'un break, moi je serais prêt à passer directement à l'autre.
Non, je pense que ça serait décent qu'on prenne un break à 11h. Ça va comme être le dernier. Mais...
Ouais, c'est comme le programme principal, c'est le plus long de la gang. C'est 1h10.
Ouais, on va voir. De toute façon, pause biologique là, au minimum.
C'est bon, parfait. Fait que, écoute, je vais mettre quelque chose même que. Je pense que j'ai de quoi que je peux mettre qui est comme one shot. Ouais, un petit 10 minutes. Fait que on prend un petit break, puis après ça, on se clenche un gros Dr Fatima.
Mais si je ne m'abuse, il y avait une suggestion de 2 pinks à un certain moment.
Oui, c'est vrai, il y avait une suggestion de 2 pinks. Oui,
tu l'avais rentré. Hein.
Oui, effectivement, t'as raison. Merci de me le rappeler. Fait que...
Merci à 2 pinks encore une fois.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Fait qu'on vous envoie la suggestion à 2 pinks, puis on vous revient avec Gravity is a social construct, and that's okay.
Vous écoutez l'antipode.
Et
I wish I had an angel for one moment of love.
Excusez, il y avait quand même une pub à la fin de la vidéo.
Ouais, c'est le fun quand il y a un post-tune à la fin de la tune.
Ouais, c'est ça. C'est toujours plaisant. Tout le temps très plaisant. Fait qu'on revient à cette chère Dr Fatima. Excusez-moi, c'est pas celui-là, c'est celui-là ici. Tudum. Fait qu'on rentre dans le gros vif du sujet. À quel point notre connaissance, c'est quelque chose de construit. Puis, tu sais, par construit, puis ça, on va le voir, souvent, on entend quelque chose de péjoratif, tu sais, comme si c'était comme artificiel, pas vrai. C'est une vieille lubie de philosophe, ça, de trouver des principes fondateurs. Tu sais, quelque chose de construit, c'est quelque chose qui est construit aussi sur quelque chose, entre guillemets. Tu sais, c'est pas...
ça peut être bien construit.
Oui.
Il y a des construits sociaux qui ont des raisons d'être sociales.
Oui,
c'est
puis
correct.
C'est ça, exact. Puis aussi, tu sais, ça veut pas dire que parce que quelque chose est un construit social, que c'est une illusion ou que c'est, tu sais, tantôt, on lisait Suzanne Hack, elle appelle ça du founderism, tu sais. C'est de dire, ben, on a des informations empiriques, tu sais, on s'en sert, tu sais, ça fait partie du tout, mais ce qu'on fait avec, puis c'est construit par-dessus, c'est fait avec, c'est pas juste ça raw, là, tu sais.
construis ta maison sur une terra firma quand même. Là. Je veux
Ouais,
dire,
c'est ça.
la,
Exact.
la seule différence, c'est qu'un construit social, ben, ça peut être déconstruit, puis ça peut être
C'est
reconstruit
ça.
de façon différente.
C'est ça.
C'est pas
T'es
une
pas condamné.
fondamentale.
In the philosophy of science, constructivism is the perspective that while reality may exist independent of our silly little human brains, scientific knowledge is socially constructed. But definitions are boring. Vibes are far more important. How do scientists feel about this idea? Let's examine the data. A perverse doctrine that subordinates rationality to politics and unbridled subjectivity. An indefensible reduction of all claims about nature to equally contingent status. A conspiracy of leftist humanists and social scientists against both science and Western civilization. Fascinating. I'm gonna go ahead and say that most scientists, I could be wrong about this, but it's the impression I get from years in the field, extensive study on the culture of science, and, being a person online, most scientists don't find constructivism that helpful an idea. But lucky for you, I'm not most scientists. My doctoral research was in astrophysics, but more recently, I've been publishing papers and making videos about the more social and political aspects of science. And the whole point that I'm trying to get across is that even the hardest of the hard sciences are still affected by messy people stuff. And I get the impression that some people are kind of starting to come around to that idea, especially in fields like medicine or maybe even technology. But not physics, right? Physics is just the fundamental truths about the universe. Particles don't care about the political climate. Radiation doesn't discriminate against women. Gravity isn't a social construct. Right? In this video, I'm going to use gravity, dark matter, and a controversial but, in my opinion, compelling theory to illustrate why even the most objective, rational, definitely not made up facts about the universe are indeed socially constructed. And don't worry, I'm going to explain what that even means. But it's going to be a lighthearted and fun video today. I promise this isn't going to end up being about racism or something heavy like that. About God, maybe. But not in the way you think. Just watch it. Trust me, it's going to be a good one. Before we get into it, I want to lay out a few working definitions because I feel like a lot of conversations about squishy human subjects like this tend to get stuck on semantics. And social constructivism is definitely the kind of term that means different things in different contexts. So if you're mostly here for the physics, bear with me for just a little while I talk about sociology. Social constructivism is broadly the idea that the natural world just kind of exists, and then scientific knowledge is what we create in our attempt to model the natural world, but it is not the same as transcendent truth about the natural world. In other words, knowledge is something we construct. One way to build a stronger intuition for what this means is to consider the opposite philosophy, objectivism. Not that weird like Ayn Rand objectivism where productivity is man's most noble calling or whatever. The scientific objectivist belief that us mere mortals can in fact deduce fundamental truths about the universe transcendent of approximations or models. But like many things in the social sciences, these philosophies exist on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have objectivism, and on the other end, strong constructivism. The two genders. Strong constructivism is where an objective, observer-independent reality just doesn't exist. Or at least that us humans are indelibly incapable of accessing it, so it might as well not exist. Closer to the objectivist end, we can consider a weak constructivism that proposes the goals of science at any given time can be reflective of the surrounding culture, or the vague claim that individual scientists' work will tend to follow the money. But somewhere between the weak and strong versions, we have a whole lot of epistemological question marks that constructivist analyses aim to answer. When does an experiment sufficiently capture a natural phenomenon? What happens when theories conflict with each other? How are unexpected outlying data points interpreted? And critically, How are any of these things influenced by the people who are doing them? I've talked in videos before about the strong constructivist end and the weak constructivist end, so today I'm concerning myself with this middle area that's less about the nature of reality or the influence of politics, and more about the choices made in the process of conducting scientific research. In Act 1, we'll look at the science. We'll go through a brief history of gravity, do a little primer on dark matter, and introduce a theory that is attempting to challenge it. In Act 2, we'll get to more of the social side. We'll learn how the scientific method is actually kind of messy, get into how this messiness opens up space for subjective interpretations, and look at what kinds of things can influence those interpretations. We're going straight philosophy of physics today, and I, for one, am very excited. Everyone ever has known that gravity exists. I want to drop something as a demonstration, but I don't actually have anything I want to drop. Gravity. Even animals know what gravity is, at least to the extent that their behavior is obviously informed by its existence. Have you ever seen a cat do a really precise jump over something? You can't tell me that that cat doesn't understand what parabolic motion is just as well as any intro physics college student. Maybe not in equations or words, but as an experience for sure. Arguably, the only beings to ever not intuitively understand that gravity exists are astronauts who just got back to Earth and haven't yet remembered that they can't just put things down in midair.
Now, you got the space station right up there.
I start with this comically basic understanding of what gravity is because some people will inevitably try to counter the whole social construct thing with this level of argument about it just being so obviously real and clearly not made up. So I bring up these silly examples to illustrate the difference between some inarguably self-evident shared experience and specific scientific descriptions of something, which is the part that I'm arguing is socially constructed. Me, you, and the cat can all agree that there is definitely some fundamentally real thing that makes some things fall into other things, but that is different than a scientific theory, and it precedes any attempt to characterize it. The earliest written descriptions of gravity come from Greece and the Indian subcontinent, and don't get much more advanced than vague notions of things tend to fall down towards the earth instead of up towards the sky. Neat! Eventually, people started using numbers to describe this tendency more precisely, and came to the conclusion that things fall down towards the earth at an acceleration of about 9.8 meters per second squared. The first mathematical formulation of gravity is often attributed to Galileo in the 17th century, but his work was built on 11th century polymath Ibn Sina's work on projectile motion, as well as 12th century polymath Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi's relations between acceleration and force. Really bummed that I missed the era of interdisciplinary Middle Eastern scientists. Or artist scientists, like Da Vinci actually helped this whole gravity progression along in between painting seminal masterpieces.
Da Vinci?
Today's physicists could never. So with this first quantitative description of gravity, we went from being able to predict that if you drop something, it will hit the ground, to if you drop something, this is how long it will take to hit the ground. We did it. We made science. However, as mathematically rigorous as this description was, it had limitations. The acceleration due to gravity of 9.8-ish meters per second squared that we use in an intro physics class actually varies depending on latitude. Someone in Ecuador, for example, would measure a slightly different gravitational acceleration than someone in Sweden, and both of them would measure something completely different than someone on, say, the surface of Mars. So while this formulation of gravity was true enough to, hit a rival ship with a cannonball or something, it was by no means internationally true, let alone universally true. We didn't get that until a guy named Isaac iterated on the work of Galileo and another guy who thought therefore he was, and came up with what we now refer to as Newton's law of universal gravitation. Universal because this description wasn't specific to gravity on the surface of the Earth. Newton's formulation described the gravitational force between any two bodies with mass. You and the Earth and the Sun, Jupiter and the Galilean moons, whatever. Any two objects with mass will experience a gravitational attraction between them that increases with either object's mass and decreases with the distance separating them. Boom, we figured it out, but for real this time. We've cracked the code to predict not only the motion of objects here on Earth, but the orbits of the celestial bodies, and theoretically anything else in the universe with mass. We're definitely right this time. But again, while more broadly useful than the previous Galilean formulation, Newton's law of universal gravitation wasn't quite as universal as he thought. For example, in the 1800s, astronomers had measured the orbit of the planet Mercury so precisely that they found it to be inconsistent with what Newton's law of universal gravitation would predict, so they figured that there has to be another planet closer to the sun. Spoiler alert, there was no such planet. It wasn't until Albert Einstein developed his theories of relativity at the start of the 20th century that Mercury's weird orbit could be explained. The TLDR of relativity is that the rate at which time passes can be altered by extremely high speeds or strong gravity. Time is relative, so everything else is too. Relativity is trippy and weird and too complicated to explain here, but the important thing that you need to know for our purposes is that we were able to make even more precise predictions about gravity with it. And many experiments have supported Einstein's theories of relativity. From Eddington's observations of gravitational lensing during a solar eclipse in 1919, to measurements of stellar orbits around the supermassive black hole Sag star in the middle of our galaxy made just a few years ago. So we're definitely right this time. As powerful as this set of theories is, even it has shortcomings. Most famously, the relativistic construction of gravity is incompatible with quantum mechanics, which is arguably the other most successful set of theories to come out of the last century of physics. Both of these paradigms make extremely robust predictions in their own regimes. Relativity describing interactions between the most massive objects like stars and black holes, and quantum mechanics describing interactions between the smallest things like particles and light waves. But they break down if you try to consider them together because they each make different assumptions about the underlying nature of reality. In quantum mechanics, causality is statistical, almost random seeming. The rate of time passage is static, and the universe has some baseline resolution, as if it's made out of really tiny pixels. For relativity to work, however, causality is necessarily deterministic. One cause can yield only one effect. Time is relative, like we said before, and the universe is continuous. There isn't some minimum size or mass that things can be. This is a great opportunity to point out the problem with thinking of scientific knowledge as either right or wrong. A naive, if not kind of understandable, reaction to these conflicting theories might be to say, well, if they contradict, one of them must be wrong. But the reality is that they both work. They both have predictive power, but each one has a particular context in which its predictive power is reliable. In fact, it doesn't really make sense to call earlier theories of gravity
predictive power, faire des énoncés qui nous permettent de faire des prédictions sur le monde. Si je mets de l'eau à 100 degrés Celsius, ça va bouillir. Predictive power.
wrong either. Newtonian gravity works for certain contexts. Galilean gravity works for certain contexts. Hell, even the ancient Greek models that were barely more sophisticated than a cat's understanding of gravity works in certain contexts. I mean, the cat got over the thing, didn't it? Sometimes the cat knowledge is enough. Each model accounts for the knowledge that was available at the time and was iterated on as our new discoveries and ideas illuminated our ignorance. And it's easy to look at this history of gravity and feel like we're coming closer and closer to the truth, but in reality, it only seems like that in hindsight. When you learn a lineage of increasingly successful theories in a physics class or science documentary, you generally don't learn about the false starts and failed ideas that were necessary to get us to where we are today. So to complicate matters a bit, we're going to shift gears into a modern problem in astrophysics that continues to illuminate our ignorance about
Ça aussi, ça contribue au mythe du scientifique, tu sais, dans son poil, là, qui découvre l'univers, tu sais, parce que, tu sais, ils vont te montrer le bout où ce que le gars, il fait Eureka, mais ils te montreront pas tout le grinding, les heures à compiler du data, tu sais, puis à checker des cartes du ciel ou whatever quoi, là, tu sais, le grinding.
Le travail non conclusif qui a
Ouais,
été
c'est
fait
ça.
par d'autres personnes avant aussi.
Aussi.
gravity, dark matter. So I'm going to go ahead and hazard a guess that most of you have heard of dark matter before and are at least vaguely aware of it as something that probably exists. As another astrophysical lady YouTuber who I get compared to a whole lot has explained in a recent video of hers,
dark matter is not a theory, it is an observation.
For our purposes today, I'm only going to explain one of these observations as a mental foothold for my broader argument, but I will refer to some of these other observations a little in passing, so if you want a more solid baseline explanation of the full set of observations, times, go check out her video, if for no other reason than to hear the dark matter rap.
Dark matter, do we need it? What is it? Where is it? How much?
Iconic. So what is this observation that we call dark matter? The graph I'm going to use to explain this is called a rotation curve, and it shows how the speed objects in orbit around something changes as they get farther away from that thing. So if we were to make a rotation curve of the solar system, for example, this axis would be each planet's distance from the sun, and each point's height would tell us how fast the planet is orbiting. And we have a trend. The further the planet is, the slower it orbits, because the force due to gravity, which is what's driving the orbit, gets weaker with distance. But it's slightly more complicated than that. The mass that gravitationally drives the orbital speed isn't just the thing in the center, it's everything inside the orbit. But because the sun is so much more massive than even all the planets put together, the difference in mass inside Mercury's orbit and the mass inside Pluto's orbit isn't that important. So the variation we see in this rotation curve is mostly just because of the changing distance. If we were to make the same graph for a galaxy rather than a solar system, we would expect the curve to look a little bit different because the mass isn't as concentrated in the center. The further you get, the more stuff you're orbiting, so instead of the graph dropping off quickly, it holds up for a while. But once you get to the edge of the galaxy where there's not that much more stuff being added, the graph should begin to drop. Or at least that's what we would have expected. Turns out, when we measure the speeds of the furthest out orbiting stars and gas in galaxies, they're going much faster than we'd expect, as if there was a lot more stuff inside those far out orbits than we can see. And that difference between the rotation curve we'd predict based on the mass of the matter we can see in the galaxy and the actual rotation curve we get when we measure how fast things are moving is what we call dark matter.
Why would you call that dark matter? You don't even know if it's matter, so shut the hell.
C'est à peu près ça que tout le monde se dit. Ouais, mais c'est pas de la matière. Pourquoi t'appelles ça de la matière? Et genre, on sait pas, on n'a pas défini que c'était, on sait juste que c'est là, on l'a observé, on sait que c'est là, mais genre, matière, pourquoi matière? Là, tout le monde va se mettre à penser quelque chose, là, tu sais. Hey, t'es muté, Max? Ou c'est peut-être juste moi, là? Non? En tout cas, moi, je t'entends pas dans le Discord en ce moment.
Ah, excuse-moi, c'était mon micro qui était fermé. Non, c'est même plus que ça. C'est encore plus du vent que ça. Parce que c'est de dire, tu sais, ce qu'elle expliquait tantôt, puis de toute façon, on va le dire, là. Tu sais, il y avait quelque chose qui, dans l'orbite de Mercure, que tu sais, il n'était pas capable d'expliquer. Fait qu'ils ont postulé quelque chose pour expliquer ça. Parce qu'ils ont mesuré quelque chose de
une
différent.
planète dans ce cas-là.
Oui,
dans
qu'ils n'ont jamais vu.
Mais par contre, ça, c'est quelque chose qui est fait en amont de ça, dans genre la vulgarisation puis tout le kit, parce que ce qu'ils appellent de la dark matter, c'est juste l'observation elle-même.
Oui.
C'est ça, le dark matter. C'est la
C'est
différence. C'est qu'est-ce qu'on voit pas. Genre,
En
genre
fait-
le fait qu'on s'imagine que ça fait référence à quelque chose de concret, ça, c'est une question de vulgarisation après. Ça arrive en amont de ça. Eux autres, ils ont juste nommé la discrepancy dark matter. C'est pas. Genre, au début, c'était pas postulé que c'était quelque chose, même de la matière ou tout.
Ben
On
non, en fait,
assume qu'il y a
non,
quelque chose, mais on sait pas. On sait rien à partir de là. On sait
Non,
juste
non.
qu'il y a une discrepancy. Là, tu sais.
Non, en fait, c'est ça. C'est de dire que pour expliquer la discrepancy, ils ont postulé qu'il y avait quelque chose.
Ouais, mais c'est arrivé a posteriori, ça. C'est ça l'affaire. Ça prenait quelque chose. Tu sais, parce qu'il y a quelque chose là. Mais le fait que c'est appelé Dark Matter à la base, je pense pas que c'est à cause que genre ils pensaient que c'était de la matière sombre.
Non,
C'est juste.
non, mais en fait, ils ont appelé ça. Ben, elle va l'expliquer pourquoi ils ont appelé ça de la Dark Matter. C'est parce que comme ils la voient pas au niveau électromagnétique, tu sais, c'est-à-dire au niveau, tu sais, mettons, d'un
Ouais.
télescope visuel.
S'il y a de la matière, on la voit pas.
Mais
C'est pratique.
C'est ça. Mais ils disent qu'ils l'aperçoivent au niveau gravitationnel parce que c'est la discrepancy qu'on vient de voir. Ils supposent qu'il y a quelque chose qui a une masse.
Quelque chose.
Non, mais parce qu'ils supposent qu'il y a quelque chose qui a une masse, mais qui reflète pas la lumière ou qui la bloque pas ou whatever. Fait que c'est pour ça qu'ils ont appelé ça de la dark matter, parce que c'est pas affecté par les photons lumineux, etc. Mais ça a une masse. Puis entre des deux choses qui composent l'univers, les ondes puis la matière, c'est ça qui a de masse. D'où le nom de matter. Mais elle va l'expliquer. Mais c'est encore plus du vent que Qu'est-ce que tu as dit? Là? Il y a un layer de plus encore devant.
The term dark matter is simply a label for a particular way in which our understanding of the universe is wrong. It is exactly this wrong, and that wrongness is what dark matter is. It's not a theory, it's a set of observations, and this is one of them. Now, everything I've said so far is just kind of categorically true. This is the prediction that our currently accepted models
Ouais,
of
c'est ça.
gravity
L'autre
expect,
personne
and
qui a
this is
référé,
the
genre
measurement.
l'autre youtubeuse, là, Angela Collier, elle l'expliquait de façon un petit peu différente, qui ressemblait plus à ce que je disais, là, justement. Là. Aussi très bonne, Angela Collier. Je pensais présenter son vidéo à propos du AI, en fait, là, quand on va retourner à ce sujet-là.
On checkera ça.
We see when we try to test those models. Neither of these things is really up for debate. I mean, I could probably make it up for debate, but I won't. But even though what I'm about to say next could be found in any intro astronomy textbook, I want to mark this point as the end of me sharing facts about dark matter and the beginning of me sharing theories about dark matter. There's a difference, and it will make more sense as we go. Would it be mixing metaphors if I said we're now crossing the event horizon? Whatever, I'm a physicist, not a poet. So the prevailing explanation for why these two curves look different is because there's some invisible stuff in galaxies. And if this were to be the case, there are two things we could confidently say about it. First, that it doesn't interact electromagnetically. It doesn't emit light or absorb light or reflect light and is therefore completely undetectable in images that rely on light coming from an object. Or according to some theories, it doesn't interact electromagnetically much, hence dark. And second, it does interact gravitationally. Because it's causing these gravitational effects on orbits, it must have mass, which means it must be some kind of matter.
So we postulate that it must have mass.
Mhm. Mais
Thus,
c'est tellement pratique aussi que, genre, la chose que ça fait pas, c'est la seule affaire qui nous permet de le détecter. Parce que le seul outil qu'on a pour détecter des choses dans l'espace, c'est des interactions électromagnétiques, grosso modo. Genre, ben, on peut. Je veux dire, genre, la
Ben,
gravité,
mettons
genre,
qu'en dehors de
ça
ça,
nous
on
permet
devient
pas de le
plus
voir.
limité.
Tu sais. Ouais, c'est ça. Fait que c'est vraiment genre, on la voit pas, mais c'est parce que genre, genre, les seuls outils qu'on a pour la voir, ben, elle fait pas ça. Contrairement à toute la matière qu'on observe dans l'univers aussi, mais genre, cette matière-là, ben, genre, elle est invisible, mais.
Oui, mais on a quand même juste postulé l'existence de quelque chose qu'on n'a
Mhm.
jamais vu juste parce qu'on a observé un phénomène qu'on comprenait pas. C'est ça qui est
Oui,
encore plus
mais.
fumeux. Là.
Ouais, mais c'est ça. Ouais, mais on la voit pas. C'est un sleight of hand. Genre, comment tu peux l'expliquer qu'on la voit pas? Ah, ben, c'est parce qu'on peut pas la voir. C'est comme vignotte. Genre, pis c'est dur. Tu sais, après, c'est comme unfalsifiable après, genre, parce qu'on n'a pas les outils nécessaires pour le falsifier. Là.
Oui, puis je te dirais même que c'est de dire on a inventé quelque chose pour expliquer que notre théorie a échoué au lieu de modifier notre théorie. Elle va y venir.
Mhm.
dark matter.
Puis tu sais, comme elle l'a mentionné, regarde tous les exemples de gravité qu'elle a donnés, ça serait pas la première fois qu'on l'améliorait, puis qu'on la changerait, puis qu'on, tu sais.
Mhm. Je veux dire, des astrophysicists préfèrent inventer de la matière ou une planète plutôt que d'aller en thérapie.
Stuff with mass that we cannot see. Hard to see stuff. And that's a fine idea. But there's kind of a big hole in it, and that's that we don't have any real idea of what it actually is. There are a ton of different models for what dark matter is, but none of them explain the observations completely. Some theories model dark matter as a kind of particle, like axions or gravitinos, or what somebody very cleverly named weakly interacting massive particles. Feels like projection. Presumably playing off that pun, somebody proposed a theory for dark matter in which it was made of large, dark objects like black holes or brown dwarfs instead of a fluid of particles, naming them massive, compact halo objects. So at one point, the competing theories for dark matter were wimps and machos. This is an astronomer's idea of a good joke, by the way. This is astronomy culture. And it's not like a nickname or something. The title of a paper I published once has the word macho in it twice because of the name of the events I'm analyzing. I was looking for black holes, and the data I used to identify them term came from the macho project, because black holes could maybe be a kind of macho. So the maybe black holes from my thesis are named things like Macho 96 Bulge 5. I always had more hope in that one. I was never convinced by Macho 98 Bulge 6. At 100,000 subscribers, I'll do a video about my old astrophysics research, so if you want to hear more about this overdone tangent, smash that subscribe button. I hate myself when I do this sometimes. Sorry, the pun thing really got me going. So some people think dark matter is an invisible particle. Some people think it's big dark things. Some people think it's a fifth dimension that somehow makes everything make sense. There are theories of cold dark matter and hot dark matter and even warm dark matter. My personal favorite theory is that of primordial black holes, which are like teeny tiny little black holes that formed right after the Big Bang, because I think it's cute. The uwu theory of dark matter, if you will. This must be what ContraPoints felt like when she said Squidwardian.
Are we really saying that word out loud to an audience of millions? Okay.
But here's the problem. None of these theories of dark matter on their own can explain all our observations. Like I said earlier, there are other kinds of observations besides the rotation curves of galaxies that point to some undetectable mass of an unknown nature. And different models of what dark matter actually is are better able to explain the different observations. This balkanization of theories is not dissimilar from the story of luminiferous ether, which 19th century physicists used to explain how light traveled through empty space. Just like with dark matter, some effectively invisible material was predicted in order to explain unexpected experimental results. And the models fractured further and further until everybody had an ether theory to match their favorite observation. And just like with ether, some scholars have called this multiplicity of models a crisis for the dark matter community, contrasting the minimal evidence of any one model with the massive amounts of effort that have gone into experimentally testing them. Dark matter is one of those particles that for decades physicists have been saying they're going to find it in the next 10 years, and haven't. We just need to build a particle collider the size of Earth's orbit. Then we'll find it. Given everything I've learned about dark matter, I'm inclined to agree with astrophysicist Mordechai Milgram's take on the search.
If one does not presuppose anything about what dark matter is, about what its interactions with baryons and with itself are, besides gravity, and about how it got to where it is, then it is hard to rule out.
My god, the shade. He's kind of right, though. It is pretty hard to rule out a theory when you have no evidence. And you might be thinking, but what about those rotation curves? We learned a whole graph for it. Isn't that evidence of something? Well, it could be. Or we could just be wrong about gravity again. Remember earlier when I said that Mercury had a weird orbit and that in order to explain it, astronomers predicted there might be another planet closer into the sun? So even though this was wrong, there was good context for it. French mathematician and astronomer Urbain Le Verrier, whatever his name was, the guy who identified Mercury's weird orbit, had actually predicted the existence of Neptune just a few years earlier based on weirdness in Uranus's orbit. He used Newtonian gravity to analyze the orbit of Uranus and found it to be slightly off from what the observers were measuring, so he deduced that there must be another planet there that nobody had seen yet, causing these gravitational perturbations. And there was! He sent his calculations to an observer who identified Neptune literally that same evening. Truly a testament of Newtonian mechanics' predictive power. So when he found similar gravitational anomalies in Mercury's orbit, he theorized that there may be, once again, an unidentified planet to blame. And since he was so successful last time he did that, the community went all in. The search began, sub-theories proliferated, and they even gave the putative planet a name, Vulcan. There's a weirdly high rate of almost having things called Vulcan in astronomy. Some of it precedes Star Trek. But as we know today, there is no planet Vulcan. And it wasn't until a century later that Einstein's theories of relativity came along to explain why. Newtonian gravity just wasn't adequate to predict an orbit as close into the sun's gravitational influence as Mercury. I share this example of planet predictions because it illustrates two diverging responses to failed experiments. You make a prediction, you take a measurement, your prediction doesn't match your measurements. What do you do? Well, when it came to Uranus, the answer was to imagine what other stuff might be affecting the data and then look for that stuff. And sometimes that works. But when it came to Mercury, it wasn't that there was unaccounted for stuff. It was that the theory the predictions were based on was inadequate. Do you see where I'm going with this? On the whole, the astronomy community in the last century-ish has determined that in order to resolve the difference between what we see and what we predict in galaxies, galaxies, there must be some stuff out there that we're not seeing. Neptune must exist, so to speak. But what if dark matter isn't like Neptune? What if it's like Mercury? What if the assumptions we use to make this were just wrong? Well, that guy Milgram, whose brutal dressing down of the search for dark matter I just quoted, kind of developed a whole theory for this. It's called modified Newtonian dynamics, or MOND, and it's an alternate explanation for the dark matter observations that makes adjustments to our understanding of gravity instead of inventing invisible ether stuff. Milgram published his first paper on MOND in 1983. 50 years after the term dark matter was coined by Fritz Zwicky. And while, as I'll get to in a minute, it's not exactly a popular theory, it is legitimate insofar as there are hundreds of peer-reviewed papers on it. It's fringe, but it's decidedly not in crackpot territory. Now, I'm not going to get into the mathematics here, mostly because I refuse to ever show an equation on this channel on principle. But in the same way that Einstein's relativity usurped Newtonian mechanics because it was more broadly applicable in the situations of extremely high speed or gravity, MOND proposes additions that also account for very low accelerations, which becomes more relevant when you're considering things on the size scale of galaxies, for example. If you want all the math, you can go read the papers yourself. My references are in the description. I feel like when my old college professors would introduce an idea and be like, and you can go home and do the derivation for fun if you want. And it's like, what nerds actually did that? I did that. The important thing is that by making tweaks to our current understanding of gravity, we would be able to make predictions for the rotation curves of galaxies that match our observations better. But like previous changes to gravity, MOND doesn't negate what came before it so much as add to it. MOND makes gravity predictable in a wider range of situations. And there's actually decently compelling evidence for MOND. Unlike most models of dark matter, people have actually used it to make successful predictions in advance of seeing data instead of adapting to data after the fact, which you would think would be an important quality to consider when evaluating competing theories. But as we'll get to later, not the most important. And to be clear, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that MOND is definitely the more correct hypothesis. I think the strongest argument against it is that it can't account for everything. In particular, it's not very good at explaining the cosmological scale dark matter observations that I didn't get into because this video needs some bounds. But when it comes to galaxy scale observations like our rotation curves, papers published as recently as last year argue that MOND actually works better than any one model of dark matter. I should also mention that there are more theories of modified gravity than just MOND, and some of them do a better job with the cosmology stuff. Kind of similar to how there are many models of dark matter that each do better or worse at explaining different pieces of evidence. I'll just say MOND for the rest of the video, but know that I'm using it as a shorthand to refer to the multiplicity of models that solve dark matter by updating gravity rather than inventing space ether. But as interesting as this theory is, the field doesn't really like it. As in, and forgive me for generalizing, but most astronomers do not take MOND seriously as an option for explaining dark matter. Anecdotally, I can say that in my 10 years studying astrophysics, I had only ever heard MOND referred to once in earnest, and any other time I had heard anybody mention it, it's been as a joke. Like, look at those kooky MOND researchers who think they're gonna solve gravity. So silly. Who's even funding them? MOND is like astronomy's embarrassing cousin that gets lumped in with ET research and is like in the space of technically legitimate but effectively crackpotty. Actually, that's not true. People respect SETI. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say most astronomers take them more seriously than they do the MOND people. But beyond my own personal experience, you just have to look at an astronomy textbook to see the institutional erasure of MOND as a viable solution for dark matter. Here's what my first astro textbook says about dark matter. To explain these nearly uniform orbital speeds in the outer parts of the galaxy, astronomers conclude that a large amount of matter must lie outside the sun's orbit. This unseen material, which is by far the predominant constituent of our galaxy, is called dark matter. Not astronomers hypothesize, not astronomers are evaluating. Astronomers conclude there is unseen material and it's called dark matter. I looked through all of my old textbooks that I had lying around, and all of them had sections on You know, dark matter that describe machos and wimps and axions and all that stuff, but literally no mention of the possibility of other formulations of gravity. Curious. Finally, we can compare the distribution of papers published on each topic. Doing a quick search on NASA ADS, which is the place to search for astrophysics articles, we get nearly 80,000 hits for papers with the keywords dark matter and only 1,600 with the keyword MOND. That's a difference of nearly 2 orders of magnitude. That's huge. I bring all this up. MOND's complete absence from textbooks, the relative lack of research conducted on it, and the way it's literally treated as a joke by people I know, to support the claim that as a community, the field of astrophysics has made a choice. And I'm not saying that the Council of Astronomers who demoted Pluto got together again to suppress MOND. I'm saying that we hit this phenomenological fork in the road, the dark matter observations, and we had the options of inventing something or adjusting our models. And despite what I see as a good amount of compelling but non-conclusive evidence supporting the validity of either option, the field has very clearly made a decision. And this is really interesting to me because it is such a good example of the problem in thinking that science is some linear march towards objective truth where we get closer and closer to the end by using our manly, emotionless rationality. That attitude towards science lacks the complexity of making choices. Like a great philosopher once said, everybody got choices. Even scientists got choices. Invent a particle we didn't see? Nope. Take another shot of modifying gravity? Yep. That was a pretty deep cut, but I couldn't not. And I cannot stress this enough. Those choices are not a failure of the scientific method. In fact, they're necessary for the pursuit of science to go anywhere at all. Wow, what a cliffhanger. I don't know about you, but I'm excited to see where this is going. But before we get to that, I gotta do my least favorite part of the video. The part where I give you the uncomfortable choice of paying for the content you're watching or not. See, I have this kind of idealistic belief that if I make something good and put it out into the world, then enough people will volunteer to pay me for it that I can keep it free for everybody who can't and not have to succumb to the various sponsor requests in my inbox. Because wouldn't it be cool if I could get paid for my work without trying to sell my viewers something they probably don't want or need? I think so. But I do understand it's a choice. Some reasons one might choose not to support me on Patreon are because they can't afford $3 a month, because they don't think the videos I make are worth that, or because they're 3 raccoons in a trench coat and don't understand the idea of compensation. I know my sincerity reads as sarcasm sometimes, but I really do sympathize with all those reasons. Especially the raccoon one, you would have no idea what's going on. But some reasons one might choose to subscribe to my Patreon are to watch exclusive videos, where I answer questions patrons ask me or interview other creators, get access to the ad-free versions of my video essays, and help me pay my bills while still making this YouTube stuff. Both choices are valid, and while there's certainly one that I'd prefer, I do understand that there can be good reasons either way. So to those already supporting me on Patreon, thank you. You're amazing. To those who already know they won't, that's fine. I'm still glad you're here. And to those considering it, you are the population who will determine how long I can keep doing this. No pressure. Just trying to help you make informed decisions. Okay, that's enough discussion of like personal finance choices. Let's get back to the fun stuff. Science choices. So I know a lot of people think that science is just the straightforward application of the scientific method, and that's very cute. The fact that this is only kind of sometimes what the process of scientific research looks like is a huge topic that I will probably make a whole video about whenever I get around to reading against method. But today, I want to draw our attention to that ineffable initiation of inquiry, the hypothesis. The formulation of a hypothesis has been called the most mysterious step of the scientific method because it's kind of hard to explain exactly where a hypothesis comes from, how a hypothesis is constructed, if you will. The choice of a hypothesis is so crucial to the whole scientific process because what you choose to study determines what you're gonna find out. This is especially important when you have multiple or conflicting hypotheses. How do you decide which one one to point the scientific method at. One might naively think, well, just systematically test all the hypotheses and whichever is the most successful determines where your theory goes. So objective. But the inherent futility of this strategy is exactly what drove philosopher Robert Pirsig, who was a university biochemistry student at the age of only 15, to abandon science entirely after only a few years of research. While doing laboratory work,
c'est lui que je parlais tantôt, là, que lui, là, il s'est attendu à ce que la science elle réponde à des questions qu'elle ne répond pas. Là.
He became obsessed with the idea of hypotheses in and of themselves, and in particular, their tendency to multiply. As you test one hypothesis, he realized, many more hypotheses will come to mind. And then when you go to test the first of those, you would get hit by yet another flood of hypotheses. The more science you do, the more untested hypotheses you have. At first, he thought this was amusing and came up with like a jokey law saying that the number of rational hypotheses that can explain any given phenomenon is infinite. But over time, his amusement transformed into a deep nihilism about scientific reasoning and its potential to lead humans to true knowledge of nature.
If the purpose of the scientific method is to select from among a multitude of hypotheses, and if the number of hypotheses grows faster than experimental method can handle, then it is clear that all hypotheses can never be tested. If all hypotheses cannot be tested, then the results of any experiment are inconclusive, and the entire scientific method falls short of its goal of establishing proven knowledge.
Establishing proven knowledge. How much you want to bet Pirsig was one of those science students who picked the subject because of how much he likes that there's only one single definite answer to each question? I say that like I wasn't also that student at one point. I thought I was so clever just choosing to learn absolute truths about the universe. For Pirsig, this realization of infinite hypotheses, along with the lack of rational tools to choose between them, was catastrophic for his ability to do science. And I guess because he couldn't reconcile these complications with what I'm assuming was his starting point of dogmatic scientific rationalism and objective truth-seeking, he dropped out of university just a few years later. But others have realized these complicating aspects of science without having existential crises. For example, in The Island of Knowledge, The Limits of Science and the Search for Meaning, Brazilian astrophysicist Marcelo Gleiser uses a metaphor of an island to describe how increasing knowledge actually takes us further from a final truth.
As the island of knowledge grows, so do the shores of our ignorance, the boundary between the known and unknown. Learning more about the world doesn't lead to a point closer to a final destination, whose existence is nothing but a hopeful assumption anyways, but to more questions and mysteries.
According to Gleiser, Pirsig's problem of infinite hypotheses wasn't a flaw of the scientific method so much as a fundamental feature of humans' knowledge acquisition. By seeking more and more information, we're not converging on truth, but fractaling out into complexity. The more you know you don't know.
Well, what I'm saying is that there are known knowns and that there are known unknowns, but there's also unknown unknowns. Things we don't know that we don't know.
So if trying to answer questions leads to more questions, and if we only have finite time and resources to attempt answering some questions, then we still need to figure out, how do we choose which hypotheses to pursue? Well, we've talked about Einstein some in this video, and he seems to have landed on some pretty good theories. So what did he think about how we should find our way to the best truths?
The supreme task is to arrive at those universal elementary laws, from which the cosmos can be built up by pure deduction. There is no logical path to these laws, only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding of experience, can reach them.
Intuition? Sympathetic understanding? What do you think all the Einstein fanboys would think if they knew their physics god believed that feelings are how we solve the universe? Einstein's not the only one who says this, by the way. In his writings on how theories are modified over time, the French physicist and philosopher Pierre Duhem suggests that scientists have to follow their good sense. And this was directly in response to the philosophical question of how to decide if a challenged theory should change in its foundational premises or the surrounding assumptions. In other words, the exact kind of fork in the road we see with dark matter and Mond. Do we go back and revise, or do we press on and add more? At the present moment, I don't think we have enough evidence in either direction to know for sure, but as I've already argued, a decision has been made. And while I agree with Einstein and Duhem's ideas of some kind of intellectual intuition intuition that guides us through the inherently open-ended parts of the scientific method, and unlike Pirsig, I believe that it's fine for this to be how science works and not evidence of its failure. I think there's an important difference between an individual scientist going off vibes and a collection of scientists going off vibes in a patterned way. Or there would be if there was actually such a thing as an individual scientist. You see, despite their aura of pure objectivity, scientists also live in a society. So now that we have some context, I want to come back to this question of what does it mean for science to be socially constructed? Like I said at the top of this video, today I'm interested in the mid-strength constructivist regime that claims the substance of scientific theories can be influenced by social factors. And I have a really good example of this that is not at all related to astrophysics. Science historian Everett Mendelsohn has done some really fascinating work analyzing the socio-political forces that led to a reductionist approach to biology in 1840s Germany, a time and place characterized by significant political unrest, emerging revolutionary movements, and an anti-autocratic energy among the youths. Mendelssohn argued that this particular social milieu, the same one that produced a young Karl Marx, in fact, resulted in a young, alienated intellectual group that sought to create counter-concepts. Whether through science or politics, they wanted to challenge the old order and their explanations for the world. Reductionism, the idea that you can best understand things by breaking them down to their fundamental pieces, was at the time considered controversial and revolutionary, and therefore was in line with the countercultural moment. And that's cool, I guess. The interesting part is that at the exact same time, biologists in France were having their own scientific revolution, except their shift was towards a holistic, organismic paradigm of biology, which is the antithetical approach to reductionism. They're opposites. Or at least they were opposite at the time. Apparently modern biology has made some advances towards synthesizing the two approaches, which is cool. Good for them. Shout out to the biologists who read the script for me. Of the stark difference between French and German biological paradigms, Mendelssohn says,
"The very existence of such a marked difference almost demands a parallel investigation of the mix of cognitive, institutional, and social factors west of the Rhine."
You'll have to read his papers for a more detailed explanation of what those factors were, but the important thing here is that differences in the social, political, or institutional contexts led to differences in the approach to formulating scientific theories. The dark matter-Mond split is, to an extent, an analogous situation. Two antithetical paradigms for solving a science problem. But the dichotomy is less visible because of what I think is the monopolizing tendency of American research. Interestingly, more of the top-cited Mond research comes from outside of the US as opposed to the top-cited dark matter research, so maybe the split here isn't as clear as Germany versus France, and it's more like the United States research industrial complex versus a small population of random foreign scientists. I'm not sure about that detail, but the point is, different context leads to different science. And I'm going to get to my theory on the context that produced the dark matter choice, but first, I want to touch on why this kind of analysis matters at all. Because the social constructedness of science doesn't just dictate how science happens, it also determines how it will interact with the rest of society. For example, via policy, education, or public communication. There are so many situations where the subjective decision-making necessary to do science has been socially influenced in negative ways. The choice of how much effort to invest in researching a cure for AIDS in the 80s. Or the existence of completely legitimate scientific research that exists solely to sell particular food products. Or the kinds of algorithms and software that venture capital is investing in right now. Or the decision to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger when they did. That one's actually really interesting. There's a whole argument that the particular ways in which people were visualizing data in order to communicate to project leadership is why what happened, and, you know, data visualization is definitely a subjective choice. I should do a video on that. Comment below if you want a video on data visualization. None of these are just outcomes of the straight logical path towards linear progress. They're choices that are influenced by and subsequently influence politics. And please don't reduce this to me saying that science is just a political tool. Science can be used to many ends, and a lot of them are good, but
dare I say, some of them sometimes are bad.
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
And I'm not saying the way to avoid doing socially bad science is to remove the subjectivity. Frankly, I don't think that's possible. I think the more productive takeaway is the need for transparency and self-awareness in those choices so they can be as well informed as possible. In a 1996 paper titled, "Is Science Socially Constructed, and Can It Still Inform Public Policy?" scholar of science and technology studies Sheila Jasanoff answers both questions with a resounding and well-justified yes, emphasizing the importance of being aware of this multiplicity of paths scientists can take.
As one probes more deeply into the causes of policy-relevant controversies, one finds that science's inability to answer questions is rarely the most pressing problem. People are often convinced that they have the right scientific answer. Constructivist analysis, which seeks even-handedly to explain variations in beliefs about the world, discovers in many such instances that disagreements about the right way to answer the quote-unquote same question reflect deeper disagreements about what the disagreement really is.
So in order to get the maximum benefit of using science to inform any kind of public policy, we have to be able to do the meta-analysis of which questions should we be asking to science. And that is outside the purview of the scientific method. It's a skill set nuclear physicist Alvin Weinberg called trans-science. Understanding science's social constructedness is also really important in education. In the US, physics education, especially at the earlier levels, frames learning science as...
Tu sais, qu'est-ce que je disais tantôt, la science est dépendante d'outils que c'est pas elle qui crée. C'est pas la seule discipline qui... Tu sais, elle évolue pas dans un vase clos, là, comme ça, là. Tu sais, si c'était le cas, il n'y a rien qui se serait inventé avant l'avènement de la science moderne, là. Puis, tu sais, les gens ont fait des outils agricoles, des armes, des toutes sortes de trucs, tu sais.
Laisse-le rouler, je vais revenir dans une minute.
OK.
Je l'écoute quand même.
Facts and tools that will lead one to uncovering objective truths. What isn't often taught is the cognitive flexibility required to make the judgment calls necessary to doing science. Remember Pirsig? If he'd had a more epistemologically mature understanding of what the point of science even is, he probably wouldn't have had a crisis of faith that made him leave the field when he realized you can't be completely rational about all of it all of the time. If your goal doing science is to find objective truth through purely rational pathways, you're gonna get stuck the fuck up when you realize you can't find the one true path. Or I guess you can convince yourself that you found it, and then everybody around you has to deal with your God complex. A complaint I hear all the time from research mentors and advisors is that their students don't know how to take initiative over their work. Like they're basically just obedient little robots who can do any analysis you instruct them to, but really struggle to come up with their own ideas. I think that struggle comes at least partially from students' lack of belief in their own subjective reasoning skills and intuitive curiosity, because we never teach them how to make imperfect decisions. I don't think we even tell them making imperfect decisions is okay, let alone necessary. For a more detailed discussion on the gap between physics students' learned perfectionism and the decidedly non-perfectionist thinking necessary to do science, check out this article called Leaving the One True Path: Teaching Physics Without Single Correct Answers, where Mylène DePenta talks about their experience helping students unlearn rigid, single-solution thinking.
Students often accepted the idea that historical models were imperfect, but assumed that the goal of science was to find the single correct model. But there are no quote-unquote completely right answers. The finite number of acceptable solutions all have their downsides, so the skill of using them isn't in memorizing or even deriving, but in discerning which situations a model is well suited to. This helps students reject objectivity without rejecting accountability.
And it's not just future scientists who have to have this knowledge flexibility. A lot of arguments against things like climate change or vaccine efficacy stem from, well, the science changed, so the science must be wrong. Maybe if we did a better job of teaching people what science actually is and how we make it, they wouldn't be recreating Pearson's very rational breakdown every...
chose qu'elle n'est pas censée faire. Ouais, mais des fois, elle se trompe. Oui, mais non, tu sais. Pas dans le sens où toi, tu l'entends. Parce que se tromper, c'est dans le sens où ces gens-là l'entendent, c'est dans un sens absolu, tu sais. Alors que c'est pas comme ça que la science marche, c'est un work in progress.
dans le framework d'un complotiste, c'est pas juste qu'ils se sont trompés, c'est qu'ils ont menti. Genre,
Mais même pas juste d'un
ils vont mentir,
complotiste, c'est
ils vont
juste de
mentir
quelqu'un,
encore.
d'un moraliste en général. Tu sais, de quelqu'un qui voit ça, tu sais, d'une manière morale, là, tu sais.
Every time they're confronted with updated information. Scientific literacy is a thing, and it's more than just memorizing some fun facts or knowing how to manipulate equations. And on that note, the social constructiveness of science plays a huge part in determining what the public believes. An example of this I really like is the recent scientific validation of millennia-old practices in Eastern medicine and spirituality like yoga or acupuncture. Today, there's peer-reviewed research proving the efficacy of these practices to the point that they're sometimes prescribed by doctors or covered by insurance. But while pointing scientific tools at these ancient methods didn't all of a sudden make them work better, it did make it so that large swaths of the population who would have dismissed them before as mystic bullshit would now take them seriously. They believe it because science said it was true. Science made it true for them, even though it had already been true for a lot of people for a long time. Similarly, at least to the extent that you probably have heard of dark matter and you probably haven't heard of MOND, your scientific knowledge of gravity has been socially constructed. Because while the physicists in my comment section are currently typing, well, duh, scientists know that we're dealing with imperfect models and gravity's obviously incomplete. Who doesn't know that? The public doesn't always know that, and they can only work with what we give them. So via what I feel safe to assess is the common belief that dark matter exists and gravity is just facts, scientific knowledge is socially constructed. The way scientists do the science has space for variation while still being science. But the reasons for that variation are not because of the science, they're because of the science's context. If you buy that whole German-French biology analysis, things like political climate and social milieu can influence the direction scientists pursue the infinite hypotheses available to them. And, like I keep saying, the field of astrophysics has largely made a choice when it comes to dark matter. The logical conclusion I'm coming to is that there must be some contextual reason for us choosing dark matter, which begs the question...
What was the reason?
Okay, so this is the highly speculative and squishy part of the video where I share the broader trends that, at least in my mind, seem aligned with the hard lean towards explaining the dark matter observations with space ether instead of more complicated gravity. I have one pitch for a purely socio-political factor because that's what this video is about, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the institutional factors that are at play as well. TLDR, academic publishing in the United States is literally just a business that motivates researchers to heavily invest in whatever is already being heavily invested in. This isn't something specific to MOND and dark matter, by the way. This is just saying that if there's some small difference in people's interest in the two theories, the financial incentives of publishing would exacerbate and solidify that difference such that there is an obvious choice of which one you should study if you want a job. The Matthew effect, a principle that says that a small advantage early on will snowball into a large advantage later on, has been measured in all aspects of publishing, from journal impact to institutional ranking and even individual careers. And papers on novel research are actually biased against in journals, even though they're more likely to become a top 1% most cited paper in the long term. Basically, financial incentives deter people from rocking the boat, even though boat rocking is fundamentally necessary to progress science. But that's enough publishing and bibliometrics talk. If you want to hear more about it, go watch this other video that I made. My point here is that if there's enough of a reason to push scientists towards one direction even a little bit, then institutional incentives would solidify and exacerbate that choice. But this still begs the question, why the initial push towards dark matter? What were the post-Big Bang inhomogeneities that led to the large-scale structure of the universe? Is a metaphor useful if you need an upper division cosmology course to understand it? I don't know, this joke's almost as obscure as the E41. What am I doing? Okay, here's my pitch. I think the collective subjective choice of choosing invisible stuff as an explanation for dark matter is consistent with physics's cultural value of simplicity. And if you don't think physics has a culture, congratulations, you're thinking like a physicist. Because believing that physicists have no culture is a well-documented part of physics culture. But yeah, the physics community, at least in post-Enlightenment Western science, highly values solutions that are beautiful or elegant, like some kind of horny Occam's razor that prioritizes solutions so simple they require feminizing for some reason. Occam's razor, by the way, also called the principle of parsimony sometimes, is the idea that the solution that makes the fewest assumptions is usually the best solution. But as much as Occam's razor can be a helpful rule of thumb that prevents nerds like Pirsig from having a complete mental breakdown, there is no rule that the universe has to be straightforward. A messy solution can in fact be more useful than a clean one, an elegant one. A really great example of simplicity as a driving value for physics is the search for a theory of everything. Hypothetically, a theory of knowledge would explain all aspects of the universe fully in one neat set of equations, or ideally one equation.
La recherche des principes premiers, puis ça, là, c'est une vieille lubie de philosophe. Là,
un coup, tu vas avoir, c'est le Saint Graal de la science. Un coup, tu vas avoir trouvé ça, t'as même plus besoin de faire de la science.
Le principe unificateur, genre.
Genre, s'ils sont tannés de faire de la science, ils peuvent prendre des vacances.
Ouais, c'est ça, exact.
Historically, we have had success with some kinds of unified theories. For example, Maxwell unified our theories of electricity and magnetism into electromagnetism. But a unified theory of everything that combines the electromagnetic force with the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force and even gravity, that's our holy grail. And I'll grant we've come kind of close. There are fairly solid models for a grand unified theory that explain all the forces except for gravity. A whole bunch of famous theories exist to make gravity play nice with the other forces. This is what string theory is trying to do, this is what M theory is trying to do, this is what loop quantum gravity is trying to do, but no one's quite gotten it to work. Honestly, gravity is just really hard to pin down in general. Like, we can predict what it does in some contexts, but we have absolutely no idea why.
Fucking magnets, how do they work?
So the search for theories of everything is illustrative of modern physics' tendency towards simplification. And I think astronomy's attempt to explain the dark matter observations with space ether instead of further revisions to gravity is consistent with a broader desire to reduce everything to a few simple rules. Because we like for things to be simple. No, more than that, we expect them to be. So we often study them as if they are. And I'm not trying to say this tendency is purely monkey brains vibes based. The principle of parsimony is useful in a lot of contexts, and there are perfectly valid statistical and philosophical arguments for not rejecting it outright. And it is objectively a cool thing when you can explain multiple different problems with a single solution. And it's awesome that that is sometimes the solution that works best. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the assumption of simplicity can affect what scientists choose to study and how they choose to study it. Not necessarily in bad ways, but in ways that limit the knowledge we generate. In a second here, I'm going to wax philosophical on why physicists want everything to be simple. But first, I want to pose this video's discussion prompt for the comments section. If you're new here, I've been ending my videos with a question for the viewer at home to answer in the comments, and in the end of the next video, I'll share some of the answers I get from this video, prioritizing commenters who also comment on other people's comments, because that's how we make this a conversation. Today's question is, what are other examples of cultural values influencing the creation of knowledge? In whatever field, discipline, or area of expertise you have experience in, what's a subjective principle you've seen affect how people explain things, or even what things people choose to explain? And it doesn't have to be in academia. Knowledge creation happens in lots of contexts, and values are always involved. I know my viewers always come through with super interesting answers, so I'm really excited to see what we get with this one. So I hope you'll take a moment to share your unique perspective with me and the rest of the audience. And check out other people's perspectives too, so you don't just have to trust mine. Did you do it? Great, thanks. So why do physicists want everything to be simple? I think the most compelling reason I've heard for this actually comes from an argument against grand unified theories, so it's a good thing that you already know what those are. That astrophysicist Gleiser that I mentioned earlier, who wrote Island of Knowledge, also wrote a really interesting contribution to a book of essays called This Idea Must Die: Scientific Theories That Are Blocking Progress, which is a super fun read, by the way. In his essay, he points out some
Faut
of
que
the
j'aille lire
shortcomings
ça.
of existing unification theories, argues that the idea is nice but ultimately kind of naive, and proposes what he sees as an explanation for said naivete.
The scientific impulse to unify is crypto-religious. The West has bathed in monotheism for thousands of years, and even in polytheistic cultures, there's always an alpha god in charge. There's something deeply appealing in equating all of nature to a single creative principle. To decipher the mind of God is to be special, is to answer a higher calling.
Okay, I know there's going to be people who have been with me this whole time whose brains just shut off when they heard the word God. If it makes you feel better, Stephen Hawking, who was a very rational guy whose biopic was literally titled The Theory of Everything, initially believed in such theories, but eventually abandoned it as well. But back to the God stuff. Despite the common belief that science and religion are opposite things that don't have anything to do with each other, there is a strong historical record that indicates that Enlightenment science was influenced by the cultural dominance of the Church in Europe, and a particular Puritanism that was the predecessor for modern physics' weird secular asceticism in the name of a god of rationality. Again, this one point will probably be a whole hour-long video eventually. But for now, let's just say that the intermingling of science and religious thought, including Western science and Christianity, is a well-documented part of its history. And I'm not trying to overstate the chain of causality here because social evolution is not so easily reducible, but the Abrahamic holdover of a single point of origin for all things just makes a lot of sense to me as the reason physicists tend towards a simple solution even in the face of a messy reality. It really feels like this desire to reduce the universe to a base set of equations is just repackaged monism with some scientific flavor. We want to make physics simple because deep down we know that we're all one, man. Damn, is that really where this video's landing? We made up dark matter because scientists want to believe in God? I guess so. Told you we'd get there. What a journey this has been. Unless this video convinced anyone that I'm not a serious scientist, I should clarify I'm not some die-hard Mon supporter who thinks that dark matter definitely can't exist. I'm more just trying to make a point that sometimes scientists pedestal certain theories because of subjective values. I don't know what's definitely true. I'm just trying to see what I can glean from the situation by keeping an open mind. And who knows, maybe they're both right. If the biggest problem with either solution is that neither can explain all of the dark matter observations, then maybe there's some combo solution in which both things are contributing to what we see. Real talk though, it barely matters which of these theories is right because it's astrophysics. The stakes are literally just ego. The thing that matters is that if we don't pay attention to how we construct scientific knowledge, we might not realize the effects it could have on people. And when it comes to actually materially useful fields like medicine or engineering or computer science or psychology, those impacts can do as much to harm as they can do to help. And as much as I am deeply a proponent of science for the sake of science, knowledge for the sake of...
Comme on a regardé dans notre première vidéo, à notre lancement, avoir plus de précision sur tel trou noir qu'on observe ou tel mesurement, dans l'espace, ça n'a pas beaucoup d'influence. Quelles théories sont acceptées pour expliquer la neurodivergence qui va décider de quelle approche, qu'est-ce qui va être financé comme service puis comme intervention? Un peu plus.
Ouais, il y a des affaires qui ont plus de stake que d'autres. Mais ça veut pas nécessairement dire qu'on peut invalider l'autre affaire. Là, ou...
Non, non.
La science fondamentale, ça reste important. Là, mais...
Oui, non, je ne dis pas que c'est important, mais il n'y a pas de stake immédiat.
Non, puis les résultats peuvent définitivement se faire attendre aussi. Là,
exactement.
Avant qu'on passe de ce genre d'observation-là à quelque chose de pratique.
C'est ça.
Mais ça, c'est... Il y en a comme celui qu'on a vu tantôt, là, le long-termist, l'ami de Jeffrey Epstein,
ouais.
Krauss. Il y en a pas mal qui pensent que c'est super important pour l'avenir de l'humanité parce que c'est avec ça qu'on va trouver comment qu'on va voyager et que ça se répande dans l'espace.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Toutes ces affaires-là, genre que c'est plus important que des trucs poches comme le climate change ou
juste manger, tu sais.
Ouais, c'est ça.
of knowledge and don't need every question we attempt to answer to immediately have a tangible use for humanity, I also think that we should maybe kind of actively try not to make knowledge that is harmful. Maybe. And it's hard to do that if you can't even admit you're making it. So yeah, our scientific understanding of gravity is socially constructed. And we are almost certainly wrong about it in the exact same way that people at any point in the past have been wrong about it. And yet, we've accomplished incredible things with it, like landing people on the moon or sending a soundtrack of humanity to the furthest reaches of the solar system. Like, Einstein predicted gravitational waves 100 years ago, and in the last decade, we started measuring them accurately enough to detect when two black holes smash into each other in another galaxy. That is nothing short of amazing. I am amazed. Amazed. But as amazing as it is, we did still make that knowledge up. And we will continue to make knowledge up. And it will continue to be cool and useful and interesting. Social constructivism doesn't negate science or say that nothing is real or that everything is relative. It makes our understanding more complete by giving us a lens to analyze why we do what we do and why we think what we think. To deny the inherently subjective humanness in the endeavor of doing physics is to deny what pushed us to do it in the first place. Not ego or money or even utility, but curiosity. That spark that only comes when you realize that you don't know something and that there might be more to the world than you thought before. That drive to describe the ineffable that we attempt to satisfy through art and religion and, yeah, even science. When you hear an astronomer wax poetic about the beauty of the cosmos, that's not rationality, that's mythology. And 1,000 years from now, when future humans look back at whatever remaining record there is about dark matter from today, and they're inevitably mixing up our science with our pop culture, and they go, look at those humans from way back in the day that invented this invisible stuff because they didn't understand this super simple thing about gravity that even kids know today. It'll be fine, because gravity is a social construct, and that's okay. Hey everyone, welcome to the end of the video. Thank you so much for making it.
N'importe quelle science, n'importe quelle connaissance de v'là 2000 ans, puis vous allez vous dire la même chose.
Ça veut pas dire qu'elle était pas utile à l'époque, puisque ça a existé, mais c'est ça. C'est toujours par incrément puis itération qu'on arrive à une version mieux adaptée à plus de choses.
Ah oui, c'est ça. On a fait un pas de géant, v'là 2500 ans, quand on s'est dit, bon, ben là, on va arrêter de postuler des affaires qui sont en dehors de ce qui existe. Là. On va être capable d'expliquer ce qui existe avec ce qui existe. Après ça, là, ça a été par petits pas, puis petits pas. Puis tu sais, quand je dis que ça s'est produit rapidement, ça s'est produit à peu près un siècle. Là. Faut que tu te dises qu'en moins 400 avant Jésus-Christ, là, un siècle, c'est vite. En termes de transmission du savoir, là, la vitesse que ça va, là, c'est rapide en crise. Fait que tu sais, la connaissance, c'est du grinding. Je le dis et je le répète, c'est du fucking grinding. Fait que le monde dit « Ah, moi, tu sais, je t'exprime. » Non, t'as pas fait de grinding. Va grinder. C'est ça la connaissance. C'est ça la science. C'est du grinding. Fait que c'était Dr Fatima, toujours plaisante, comme à l'accoutumée, plus la présentation de votre humble serviteur. J'espère que vous n'avez pas trop saigné du nez. C'était une soirée plutôt théorique.
Non, c'est correct.
T'as l'air fatigué.
Ouais, on avait moins d'énergie, mettons, pour la partie vidéo CINE-MASSUE après tout ça, mais de toute façon, on a comme préempté pas mal nos commentaires. Donc, c'est ça.
C'est ça. Fait que, écoute, la semaine prochaine, on va voir une application de ce dogmatisme-là de la science, qui est de faire croire que des thérapies de conversion, c'est scientifiquement prouvé parce qu'on peut modifier le comportement. Ça, sans nécessairement dire si c'est une bonne chose.
Ça, c'était pour vendredi.
Vendredi prochain.
Oui, vendredi prochain.
En plein ça.
Donc, c'est ça. Il va y avoir une continuité thématique dans ces jours.
Exact. Ouais.
Entre ces deux soirées-là. Puis c'est ça. Nous autres, lundi aussi, comme celui que j'avais prévu la semaine passée, qu'on va probablement passer
C'est
demain à
parfait.
la place. Donc, ça va être une intersection entre pseudo-philosophie, AI et content farm sur les médias sociaux, sur YouTube. La vidéo qui nous a été suggérée par, si je me rappelle bien, Symbiotic Praxis.
OK.
Puis on va revenir là-dessus. Là. Ça va être un visionnement assez fertile aussi. Donc ça va être ça, peut-être plus de AI ou plus de stoïcisme. Je n'ai pas décidé encore.
Bon, ben
C'est
écoute, je
ça.
vais te laisser. Je vais laisser ça à ta discrétion. Écoute, je me suis occupé. Disons que ce show-là, c'est pas mal moi qui l'ai monté. Fait que écoute,
Mhm.
I'm leaving you space.
C'est ça. Puis on va voir en fin de semaine là, s'il y a
Ouais.
des actualités qui vont nous sauter à la
Il y en a
face
tout le
aussi.
temps un ou deux. Là. Moi, en tout cas, tant qu'à moi, il y
Ouais,
a toujours une petite affaire ou deux, c'était là au moins. Là, fait que...
c'est ça. Puis on va aussi se préparer là, pour la soirée spéciale
Ouais.
électorale de mardi prochain, où on va couvrir les fatidiques élections. Peut-être les mêmes dernières élections aux États-Unis, avec notre ami Pierre sur la chaîne Les Manigances.
Ah, que ça va être dégueulasse comme soirée électorale. Ça va être. C'est pas dans le
Ah,
sens que ça va être dégueulasse pour nous autres, tu sais, d'être sur la chaîne, mais
en tout cas, si vous êtes pas tanné de m'entendre râler de la merde, vous allez m'entendre râler de la merde. Comme j'ai dit à tout le monde, je risque d'être d'une humeur assez massacrante parce que je la file pas, celle.
Ouais, non, ça.
C'est ça.
C'est le genre d'élection que c'est pas fini tant que c'est pas fini.
On est dans le pire timeline.
Ouais,
Ouais,
c'est
non,
ça.
c'est ça. Je veux dire, je me dis que ça va être genre. En tout cas,
Puis tu sais, on
ça
s'entend,
serait
là.
de mauvais goût de faire un pool de violence politique possible, là, mais
Ouais, ouais,
peut-être le
mais
faire
on
pareil.
s'entend que si c'est Kamala Harris qui passe, puis il y a bien des chances, ça va brasser.
Ouais, ouais, puis si c'est Trump, ça va brasser pareil.
Ça va
Ça va
brasser
brasser
aussi.
à nous. Je veux
C'est
dire,
ça.
regarde, genre genre à l'avance de cette élection-là. On a déjà
Ouais.
eu le cas d'un gars, d'un Trumpiste qui a décidé de brûler une boîte de ballottes anticipées parce qu'ils savent que les ballottes anticipées, c'est plus des démocrates
Ah,
que
ben
les.
oui.
Fait ils ont décidé que vu que c'est plus des démocrates, ben c'est illégitime. Fait que
Ah, ben
ça, puis
oui.
il y a toutes sortes de méthodes de rat fucking qui vont sortir, incluant
Hum.
du vigilantisme et de la violence politique, là, genre. Ça, c'est avant qu'ils se mettent à brasser de la merde. Là, s'ils perdent, là, c'est là que ça va se mettre à chialer. Pour vrai, s'ils gagnent, ils vont juste, je sais pas, faire une purge ou whatever. En tout cas. Il n'y a
Ouais,
pas de, il y
non,
a
mais
pas de bonne, il
c'est
y a pas de bonne
charmant.
résolution. Genre, ça sera pas fini mardi, c'est
Ouais, non,
sûr.
non, 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 c'est
Euh,
clair.
c'est sûr et certain que Trump, il proclame victoire mardi, de toute façon, qu'il gagne ou qu'il perde.
Ben
Puis
oui.
après ça, ben, ça va être ça va être de la merde. De la merde qui était tellement fucking prévisible. Genre, ça fait ils ont eu 4 ans pour se préparer à ça, là, genre. Parce qu'il savait qu'il allait recommencer Trump encore puis qu'il allait refaire la même affaire, là. Genre, il a triché la dernière fois, puis ils avancent qu'ils vont tricher cette fois-là aussi. Puis genre, ça passe ou ça casse, là. Genre,
Ah ouais.
tout cas, tu sais, de la politique normale puis ennuyeuse, là.
Ouais,
Genre,
ouais.
on s'ennuie quasiment de ça.
Ah, quasiment. Ah, écoute, on va vivre un régime fasciste, faut croire. Ou en tout cas, on en vient un qui essaye de
Hmm.
s'implanter, c'est à tout le moins.
Ouais, ben, je veux dire, ça dépend pour qui, là. C'est ça. Ça dépend pour qui, parce qu'il y en a déjà pour qui que c'est
Ouais,
déjà pas mal du fascisme, là.
ouais.
C'est ça.
On va
Comme
dire
tu
du.
dis, le
On va.
fascisme, c'est l'impérialisme qui
Ouais,
revient à la maison, puis qui en vient à
ouais, c'est ça.
affecter ceux qui se croyaient
Immunisé à ça.
safe, immunisés à ça. C'est ça. Bref,
Ah ouais, la joie. La
c'est
joie.
ça. On est déjà dans le pire timeline, là, mais on essaye de rester positif et entertaining au travers de ça.
Des fois, c'est pas toujours évident.
Non.
C'est comme. Il y a une affaire que j'ai vue récemment. Écoute, je sais pas si ça va changer parce que tu sais, ça dépend de l'élection aux États-Unis. Tu sais, on dit, tu sais, c'est sûr que Poliev, il va rider la wave, tu sais, de Trump, dépendamment si Trump gagne ou perd. Mais j'ai vu que Yag Meeting a annoncé que il empêcherait le Bloc puis les conservateurs de faire tomber le gouvernement. Fait que je sais pas si c'est parce que eux autres voulaient tirer un profit, tu sais, du timing. C'est au moins ça, là. Je veux dire,
Je veux dire, il a fait le bon call là-dessus parce
Oui.
qu'il n'y a rien à gagner puis tout à perdre en ce moment à aller en élection là. Aussi bien attendre que la balloune elle se
Ouais.
dégonfle, là, ou lui laisser au moins la chance de se dégonfler. Mais écoute, Poliev, genre, ça fait depuis le fucking convoi qui dit que la balloune va se dégonfler, puis là, ça fait 2 ans, puis il est en avance dans un sondage. Ça aide pas que Justin Trudeau soit toute la merde, là, mais je veux dire, c'est pas entre un libéral poche puis
Ouais.
la
Ouais, non.
purge, même continuer à choisir le libéral poche, là,
Ouais, non, c'est
malheureusement.
que-
Ou voter pour personne, mais genre, au moins, pas voter pour fucking
Ouais.
Poliev juste pour changer, genre,
Ah
pour
ouais.
changer à quelque chose de pire.
Comme quelqu'un qui m'a déjà dit, tu sais, les liberals, je vais quand même stander avec parce qu'au moins, ils vont pas me purger. Tu sais.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Ah non, non, le
Voter
preacher,
du-
voter du
Il est pas au fédéral du
Ouais, une
N.
chance.
Une chance.
Ben, une chance, mais en même
Le-
temps, je pense pas qu'il pognerait dans les provinces
Poliev, c'est le
anglophones.
même style de
Ouais.
phénomène, là, en tout cas.
Ah, ça sera pas beau, ça sera pas beau.
Ah, écoute, ça va, tu sais, on sait pas. Ça va peut-être,
Ah.
l'affaire, c'est que si ça percute assez aux États-Unis, que tout le monde est assez dégoûté, peut-être qu'on va juste, genre, se rendre compte que c'est la même affaire, à peu près, genre, le poiliévrisme, là, puis que, genre, on va. Là, genre, les Canadiens mécontents vont décrocher de ça, puis je sais pas, voter NPD, ou pire, essayer. Il faudrait. Genre, Jagmeet ne rentrera jamais juste à cause que c'est Jagmeet, là, mais il va peut-être éventuellement être remplacé par quelqu'un de plus éligible. Ça leur arrive des fois, le NPD, d'être au pouvoir. Là. C'est déjà arrivé avant, puis on a eu la médecine universelle. Écoute, ça vaut la peine d'essayer. C'est
Ouais, mais.
n'importe quoi sauf un esti de raciste, homophobe,
Ah ouais,
misogyne, alpha, pro-crypto, pro-Trump, etc. Libertarien,
Ouais.
anti-filet social.
Pour tout de suite, on sauve les meubles, là, même si c'est que j'aime pas ça me dire ça, parce que Chris, il me semble que c'est tout le temps ça qu'on fait, tabarnak.
Ah ouais, non, c'est ça. Tant qu'on change pas les fondamentaux de notre façon de relater les uns les autres et même de relater avec la réalité, ben, on répète tout le temps la même affaire. On est tout le temps à 2 pas du fascisme, là, à une crise du fascisme.
Ouais.
C'est ça l'affaire, tu sais. On peut faire le lien presque année pour année, genre en 1918, la
Hum.
pandémie de l'influenza, puis le début du fascisme
Ben, gars, on a parlé
en
de la crise.
2023, 5 années plus tard. Écoute,
Ah ouais,
c'est genre,
on a parlé de
on
la.
n'est pas, on n'est
on-
pas hot pour passer au travers d'une crise sans virer vers les pires instincts de l'humanité, apparemment.
Non, mais écoute, tu sais, on parlait de la crise de la science, que ça suit le fascisme, tu sais, à soir, ben c'est ça. C'est ça.
C'est ça. On commence. C'est ça. Ça finit tout le temps avec le fascisme, même si on n'était pas parti pour ça, ben, ça finit toujours avec le fascisme. Voilà.
C'est donc plaisant.
Tout ce que vous aimez pas est du fascisme. Ben voilà. C'est pour ça qu'on est antifasciste.
Ben, c'est ça exactement. En fait, c'est pas que tout ce qu'on n'aime pas est fasciste, c'est que tout ce qui est fasciste, on n'aime pas ça.
Ça marche. Ça marche dans les deux sens.
Ouais.
Ouais. Bon, ben, là, sur cette super note,
Ouais.
super positive, on va dire merci à tout le monde qui a été présent avec nous.
Ah ouais, ben,
Les lurkers, les chatters, ceux qui nous encouragent avec des beats, des subs et toutes
ah
ces
oui.
choses.
Moi, écoute, je remercie tout le monde de m'avoir suivi parce que j'ai conscient que c'était ultra geek ce soir, là. Mais écoute, c'était comme nécessaire, là. Il y a trop de monde là, qui voit la science un peu trop comme une religion, tu sais, puis
C'est une question de pacing plus que d'autres choses, là.
Ouais.
Le sujet reste intéressant, là. Mais en tout cas, bref, on finit quand même à une heure
Ouais.
raisonnable. On a
Ouais,
juste
moi,
moins
je m'attendais à
commenté
déborder plus que
pendant.
ça, sincèrement.
Ouais, on a juste moins commenté pendant la vidéo de Fatima,
Ouais.
mais on n'avait plus grand-chose à dire parce qu'on.
Oui, puis tu sais, puis c'est pas juste ça, tu sais. Tu sais, Fatima, c'est un peu comme Abigail, tu sais, des fois, on est comme. Tout est là, tout est
Ouais,
dit,
tout est là, tout est dit.
c'est ça. C'est ça. Fait qu'on va vous laisser là-dessus, au bon soin de la Sainte Trinité de l'Antipode, de Dieu, Kevin et Sophia, avec un adieu sectaire comme à l'accoutumée. Fait qu'on vous souhaite une bonne nuit, on vous
On raid-tu
remercie.
quelqu'un?
Il y a le bon vieux temps qui est là. Fait que c'est pas mal le seul que moi j'ai online. Fait que ça va être pas mal là qu'on va s'en aller. Fait que
il
on
va être
va
encore
avoir un
content.
raid à la fin du stream. Fait que restez là si ça vous tente d'aller. Il est écrit juste chatting, soirée sous-sol. Bonne vieille cuisine. Bon ben écoutez, je pense qu'il fait de la cuisine, ça semblerait-il. Fait que
C'est la 3e fois qu'on rappelait que chez lui, toujours sympathique. Donc, c'est ça. Sinon, on se voit lundi à 6h. Puis prenez soin de vous et de vos proches.
Passez une belle fin de soirée.